The Vatican's greatest terror wasn't warfare or uprising, but an ancient Bible predating Rome itself, wrapped in mystery and containing forbidden writings. It emerged from Ethiopia's highlands, bearing narratives the Church had suppressed and realities it couldn't command. Within its leaves lay Gospels the Western world had eliminated, names the Vatican refused to acknowledge, and a historical account etched in stone, never altered by ecclesiastical assemblies. These aren't myths, they're documented records, preserved in concealed chambers where mysteries still linger. Tonight, we enter history's hidden corners. If revelations like these intrigue you, make sure to subscribe, so get comfortable, shut your eyes, and allow the narrative to begin. It appeared without warning, lacking fanfare or proclamation, covered in heavy fabric and secured with wax. The container bore no identification, save for one phrase in weathered ink, barely visible through accumulated dust. Within lay a volume that shouldn't have survived, not because of forgery, but because of authenticity. Dangerously authentic. And this authenticity contradicted the historical narrative the Vatican had meticulously constructed. The individual who unveiled it was a Jesuit academic called Father Luca, reserved and methodical, recognized for his commitment to preserving holy manuscripts. He dedicated most of his existence in the frigid examination chambers beneath the Apostolic Palace, organizing abandoned documents. Yet nothing had readied him for this discovery. The vellum within the container was ages old, though maintained almost flawlessly. The cover was unusual, constructed from material he couldn't identify, but the script first disturbed him. Ge'ez, Ethiopia's ancient language, understood by merely a handful of contemporary scholars. As he examined the contents, his fingers started quaking. The initial surprise was the arrangement of the texts. Genesis appeared, yet it wasn't the opening. Preceding it, another narrative. The Book of Enoch, a manuscript the Vatican had dismissed for generations. It described angels descending from paradise, of prohibited relationships, of watchers who revealed to humanity knowledge never intended for mortals. Father Luca had encountered mentions of it previously, dispersed throughout margins and questionable registers, but he'd never witnessed it complete, not like this present form. And then arrived the second revelation. Not merely Enoch, but Jubilees, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Book of Tobit, the Gospel of Mary. Narratives the Western Church had eliminated, removed from its authorized collection after the assemblies of Carthage and Nicaea. Yet here they existed, not concealed in some exclusive collection, but transparently combined together as Holy Scripture. In Ethiopia, this represented the Bible. Not a gathering of random compositions, but a consecrated, comprehensive witness. Father Luca shut the volume and secured the entrance behind him. He didn't rest that evening. He didn't even worship. He inscribed a solitary phrase in his confidential diary, a practice he'd maintained since his seminary days. Just this: everything transforms. Within 2 days, the document was sealed once more and removed into the deeper sections of the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Not obliterated, not refuted, merely concealed. As though positioning it behind secured metal barriers would render its contents simpler to dismiss. But not everyone dismissed it. A handful within the Curia murmured that Father Luca had vanished the subsequent year. Others maintained he was relocated discreetly to an alpine monastery. Nobody ever verified his location. And the volume, though never recorded officially, is reportedly still housed within the Vatican boundaries, waiting not because of danger, but because it reveals a narrative the Church cannot rationalize. A narrative older than Rome, a Bible composed in darkness and trusted still by countless believers. The rainfall had continued since nightfall. It wasn't the variety of tempest that roars and announces itself, but the subdued variety, the variety that makes the Vatican's stones appear to pulse. The sentries at the bronze entrances adjusted in their garments, glancing just once as a modest wagon crossed the plaza, its wheels reverberating against the damp marble. Upon it, protected by thick canvas and bound with cord, was a solitary wooden container. No accompaniment, no ceremony, simply one individual guiding the wagon, his features concealed beneath his coat's covering. Within the Vatican Apostolic Archive, the passages were dimmer than typical. The flame lamps had diminished low, projecting extended shadows across the surfaces. Only one illumination remained constant deep in the restricted section where Father Luca occupied the reception chamber. He'd been informed something exceptional was arriving. He hadn't been informed from what location. The individual with the wagon said nothing. He merely positioned a document holder on the table, acknowledged once, and vanished back into the passage. Father Luca opened the holder and discovered only a message. It was composed in Latin, with the papal emblem pressed faintly into the document. The penmanship was unknown. It stated, for restricted viewing, not to be duplicated, not to be registered in the catalogue. That was when he experienced the initial unease. The container was substantial. It required him nearly 30 minutes to break the seal, his digits sliding against the moist cord. The cover groaned as it separated, and initially he assumed the container was vacant. But concealed beneath multiple layers of fabric and padding was a volume unlike any he'd encountered. Not simply aged, but primordial. Not simply maintained, but venerated, enclosed in crimson silk and fastened with a plain cord. When he extracted it free, the chamber transformed. The atmosphere grew motionless, the quietness denser. Within the volume were characters he couldn't immediately decipher. The script flowed across the sheets, the curved and elegant, formed by a language he'd examined only superficially in his earlier years. Ge'ez, the ceremonial language of the Ethiopian church. He proceeded to the volume's middle. The account it presented didn't correspond with the one he'd devoted his existence to defending. Enoch travelled among celestial beings. Mary communicated not as a container, but as a seer. There was no book of Revelation. Rather, there was something termed the Apocalypse of Peter. The sequence of the canon wasn't just altered, it was inverted, and inserted into the concluding sheet was something additional. A correspondence, unsealed, incomplete. It had no identification, only this statement. If this holds truth, then our foundation rests on shifting ground. That evening, Father Luca positioned the volume in the archive's deepest vault, behind a barrier nobody accessed. He documented nothing in the registers. No reference number, no designation. Only quietness. And by daybreak, information had already circulated to the congregation for the doctrine of the faith. The volume was no longer simply a document. It was a danger. It's simple to assume that Rome was the origin. The marble pillars, the Latin invocations, the sound of footfalls in St. Peter's Basilica, all convey the narrative of a church constructed at the world's core. But what if the core was never Rome? What if the most ancient Christian narratives exist not beneath Italian stone but in Africa's highlands? Long before the Vatican ascended to dominance, long before the initial popes received crowns, the Ethiopian people were already composing their own consecrated history. They didn't acquire it from the West. They preserved it with them, inscribed into stone sanctuaries, illustrated on vellum, with pigments created from pulverized blossoms and transmitted in a language the Roman Church couldn't completely comprehend. The Ethiopian Bible predates the Latin Vulgate. It predates the authorized canon validated by any assembly. And it contains additional books, numerous additional ones. Not portions or folklore, but comprehensive manuscripts, maintained, safeguarded, and recited publicly for generations. Some claim it originated with a sovereign present, that when the Queen of Sheba encountered King Solomon in Jerusalem, she departed to her realm not only with treasure and understanding, but with something considerably more significant. She was expecting a child, Menelik, who would mature to become Ethiopia's first emperor. That offspring would also transport with him Israel's teachings that would establish the basis of a Christian conviction untouched by European impact. But here exists the revelation that disturbed the Vatican. According to Ethiopian custom, Menelik also transported home something additional, a consecrated object never intended to depart Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant. The Roman Church proclaimed this unthinkable blasphemy, but they never dispatched anyone to confirm it. Rather, they rejected it in quietness, even as the Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained the Ark concealed in a protected chapel where only one monk is permitted to witness it for his entire existence. That quietness intensified when Vatican academics began examining manuscripts. The Ethiopian scriptures contained narratives excluded from every Western Bible, compositions that discussed fallen celestial beings, heavenly expeditions, and a more profound function for women in early theology. These weren't fantastic fabrications. They were profoundly established in custom, with ancestry documented back to the earliest apostles. One academic, Father Bellini, once observed in a confidential correspondence, "This isn't a departure from our history. This is an entirely different history." That correspondence was never circulated. When he perished in 1968, the correspondence disappeared. There are chambers in the Vatican containing books, but not all books are equivalent. Some are secured behind transparent barriers, some are never mentioned again. And then there are the books that make even the surfaces appear to murmur. This isn't simply a matter of which Bible is more ancient, it's a matter of whose reality was maintained and for what reason. The one that originated from Ethiopia's mountains, older than Rome and potentially more enlightened than the West, was concealed away in the Vatican's darkness. The sheets were polished, weathered, and curiously heated to contact. Father Luca moved his digits over them cautiously, as though the pigment itself might still possess life. He'd witnessed countless documents in his years beneath the Vatican library, but none resembling this. This volume didn't murmur. It declared. Each sheet in the Ethiopian Bible was manually inscribed in Ge'ez, with crimson and ebony pigment flowing between intricate margins of golden leaf. The artistry alone would have situated it among the most precious items in the Vatican collection, but it wasn't the magnificence of the volume that made Father Luca hesitate. It was what shouldn't have existed there. He proceeded to the first peculiar entry with a measured breath. The Book of Enoch. A comprehensive version. Not a portion, not a reference, incorporated into another gospel, but the entire record of angels who descended to earth, of prohibited wisdom granted to mortals of judgment, executed by powers outside the recognized heavens. The Roman Church had designated Enoch blasphemous by the 4th century, and yet here it existed, positioned transparently between Genesis and Exodus as though it had perpetually belonged. Deeper in, there were additional ones. The Book of Jubilees, the Book of Tobit, the Apocalypse of Peter, and then something different. A gospel without identification. It commenced with a woman's expression, composed, resolute, and melancholy. The composition indicated it was Mary personally, not as a passive figure at the narrative's margins, but as an observer, an instructor, a carrier of realities the apostles dreaded to convey. Father Luca's hands trembled. These weren't questionable writings. They were scripture, honoured and recited publicly by countless Ethiopian Christians for generations. And yet the Church in Rome had invested equally long suppressing these identical sheets under multiple layers of quietness. The subsequent morning he transported a solitary reproduction of the Gospel sheet to his superior, Monsignor della Croce, a frigid and strategic individual, recognised for defending the Church from concepts that wandered excessively distant. He stated nothing as he examined, but when he encountered the words, "I witnessed the Son of Man adorned in radiance, and he mourned for the world that would neglect him," he ripped the sheet in 2 portions and released it into the hearth. "You didn't witness this?" he stated. "And if you mention it again, you won't witness this library either." Father Luca didn't dispute. But that evening he transcribed the gospel passage again, from recollection. Then he secured it within a wooden container beneath his sleeping quarters. 10 years subsequent, that container was discovered unopened beside his remains. There are sheets in every consecrated volume that console us, and there are sheets that unsettle. But the ones that alarm the Vatican most are the ones that accomplish both. Sheets that discuss angels and women, of enigmas older than assemblies, and of a conviction that once travelled a different route. Sheets that to this moment the Church will not acknowledge exist. But they do. The designation Enoch scarcely appears in the Bible. Most of us recognise. Just a phrase or two, a murmur in the extended ancestry of Genesis. Enoch travelled with God and then he vanished. That is everything. No wonders, no declarations, just quietness. But in the Ethiopian Bible, that quietness concludes. The Book of Enoch isn't only maintained there, it's venerated. It extends across countless sheets, abundant with visions, cautions and mysteries. In these compositions, Enoch doesn't simply travel with God, he is transported beyond the atmosphere, past the celestial bodies, into a domain where angels maintain surveillance over the world's destiny. These angels aren't gentle and luminous, they are designated the Watchers, and what they observed they were never intended to contact. According to the account, the Watchers were dispatched to direct humanity, to instruct, to defend, to monitor. But something transformed. These angels gazed upon mankind's daughters and coveted them. They violated the divine separation and descended to earth. They acquired spouses. They produced offspring. And those offspring were giants, beings of tremendous stature and peculiar wisdom. They instructed humans how to construct weapons, combine concoctions, perform enchantments, interpret celestial bodies, and manipulate metal. They distributed the heavens' mysteries. The world transformed rapidly, excessively rapidly. The Vatican has never formally acknowledged this version of the account, because if it holds truth, then some of what humans comprehend didn't originate from divine inspiration or gradual discovery. It originated from a rebellion among angels. When the Vatican first obtained a comprehensive copy of the Ethiopian Book of Enoch in the early 20th century, it was discreetly sealed and categorized under non-canonical investigations. That was their method of stating, not authorized, without stating, we are apprehensive of what it encompasses. But, within the confidential chambers of the Apostolic Archive, the designation Enoch maintained appearing in correspondences, in diaries, in cautions. One notation dated 1948 was composed by a cardinal who had interpreted part of the volume manually. This manuscript proposes a conflict in heaven before Genesis. If we acknowledge this, then the creation account isn't the origin, it's the consequence. A second revelation arrived when academics recognized the Book of Enoch corresponded with details from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were uncovered shortly afterward. Distinct cultures, identical account. The inquiry was no longer whether the Watchers were genuine, it was why this account had been eliminated and who determined it was excessively dangerous to remain in the canon. In Ethiopia, they never eliminated it. The Watchers are still discussed. Enoch is still venerated. Their sanctuaries still perform his visions publicly during extended radiant liturgies. But in Rome, the designation Enoch remains a subdued caution, a figure excessively ancient, excessively audacious, and excessively abundant with recollection. His volume describes a period before time, a descent before the descent, and a reality the Vatican may still be attempting to reverse. Not because it's inaccurate, but because it never ceased being accurate. In the extensive passages of the Vatican, where history is maintained behind secured entrances and quietness, there's a narrative almost nobody mentions. Not because it was dismissed, but because it was never intended to be recollected by the West. It originates not in Rome, but in Jerusalem during King Solomon's period. Solomon, David's offspring, constructor of the first temple recognized for understanding and prosperity. The Bible informs us he governed over Israel in tranquility. But in Ethiopia's highlands, a different narrative is conveyed, one that persists in the sheets of a volume the Vatican has perpetually maintained at a separation. According to the Kebra Nagast, a consecrated Ethiopian manuscript older than most Western historians will acknowledge, the Queen of Sheba journeyed to encounter Solomon, not simply out of inquisitiveness, but through divine direction. She departed not only with treasure and wisdom, but with a child. That child, Menelik, would become Ethiopia's first emperor. And according to Ethiopian custom, he transported something additional with him, a mystery the Rome Church still refuses to recognize. He transported Solomon's lineage. That straightforward assertion transforms everything. If accurate, it would signify that Ethiopia, not Europe, possesses the most direct royal descent to David's house. And it would signify that the divine authority to govern, assumed by medieval European monarchs to be transmitted through their own descents, may have already belonged to another nation, distant from their palaces and cathedrals. The revelation arrived during the 13th century, when Ethiopian priests transported copies of the Kebra Nagast to Jerusalem. According to correspondences stored deep within the Vatican archives, a Franciscan monk documented witnessing the scrolls and immediately composed to his supervisors in Rome. In one surviving portion he composed, "They assert Solomon's throne was never vacant, only relocated, and that the church occupies the incorrect location." This was beyond just a political complication, it was a theological one. If Ethiopia's emperors genuinely descended from Solomon, then they possessed both royal and priestly authority. They were monarchs by lineage and guardians by God's intention. That positioned them above any crown in Europe, perhaps even above the Pope personally. Some within the Vatican rejected the assertion as folklore. Others weren't so certain. A sealed documentation from the year 1915, composed by a Jesuit missionary, depicted a ceremony at the Ethiopian royal palace involving a scroll enclosed in golden fabric. The missionary had been informed it was part of the original blessing transmitted down from Solomon to Menelik. He was never permitted to witness what was inscribed on it. Within 5 years, that identical missionary returned to Rome and abandoned the order. Today, the Vatican seldom mentions Solomon's lineage, but within Ethiopia's churches, it remains deeply revered. This bloodline isn't remembered through titles or royal emblems, but through hymns, sacred chanting, and stories etched in ancient stone. And maybe that's what disturbs the Vatican most of all. That far beyond Rome, inside churches hewn from mountainsides, an unbroken line still endures, unbowed and untouched by Western historical revisionism. This isn't merely a manuscript, it's a confrontation, a silent tempest concealed within parchment and devotion. The Kebra Nagast, meaning the glory of kings, has existed in the margins of Western chronicles for ages. In Ethiopia, it's holy scripture. Within Vatican walls, it's regarded with suspicion not because it's fabricated, but because it presents a narrative the Church never dominated. Composed in the archaic Ge'ez tongue and transmitted through successive generations of Ethiopian clergy, the Kebra Nagast asserts something the Roman Church has never publicly proclaimed: that Ethiopia, not European lands, preserves the authentic royal descent of ancient Israel, that the Ark of the Covenant, once humanity's most sacred artifact, was removed from Solomon's sanctuary and transported to Axum, not by raiders, but by his legitimate heir. This assertion isn't recent. It's resonated throughout Ethiopian sanctuaries since the earliest ages. But when the Vatican initially obtained a Latin rendering of the Kebra Nagast in the early 18th century, it sparked subtle turmoil within Vatican chambers. The rendering had been commissioned by a Jesuit named Pedro Paez, who'd spent years among Ethiopian intellectuals. His efforts were greeted with quietness upon his return. No commendation, no critique, merely quietness. Because after examining the manuscript, that quietness starts making sense. The Kebra Nagast chronicles Solomon's meeting with the Queen of Sheba, but it extends further. It grants her a presence filled with intellect and authority. It recounts her vision where the child departed Israel and took root within her body. It speaks of her offspring, Menelik, conceived not in transgression but in divine purpose. And most audaciously, it discloses that Menelik journeyed back to Jerusalem, received welcome from the priesthood, and departed with the ark itself, not through coercion but through celestial approval. For the Vatican, this represented hazardous doctrine. It relocated the epicenter of sacred chronicles away from Rome, away from European territories, and into African soil. It bestowed upon Ethiopia not merely a sacred treasure, but the spiritual legitimacy accompanying it. In a confidential correspondence dated 1906, a Vatican consultant cautioned the Pope that dissemination of the Kebra Nagast might foster a perspective of Christian chronicles that doesn't necessitate Rome. That correspondence was preserved in the Archivum Secretum and remained hidden for 7 decades. But the unexpected development that emerged came not from the manuscript itself, but from what it stimulated. When Emperor Haile Selassie governed Ethiopia during the 20th century, he was perceived not simply as a sovereign, but as a living connection to Solomon. And for countless individuals globally, including throughout the Caribbean and the Americas, he became an embodiment of sacred monarchy, a figure whose legitimacy derived not from military domination, but from primordial covenant. The Vatican never openly addressed the Kebra Nagast. But, in the lower chambers of the Apostolic Archive, one of the limited copies maintained there bears a handwritten annotation. In the border it states, "If this holds truth, the Ark isn't missing." It was never our responsibility to protect. The Kebra Nagast was never prohibited by the Vatican, but it was never embraced either. It occupied a peculiar space, never formally denounced, yet never examined. It wasn't held in restraints, only in quietness. And that quietness was the most revealing aspect of everything. To comprehend why this manuscript was concealed for ages, you must comprehend what it accomplished to the narrative the Church had devoted so much time constructing. The Kebra Nagast didn't simply propose an alternative interpretation of Christian chronicles, it proposed a competitor. A comprehensive living heritage that had never travelled through Rome, never submitted to its assemblies, and never sought its authorization. Inside the Vatican, chronicles were perpetually inscribed in strata of Latin and legislation, canonical legislation, ecclesiastical legislation, sacred legislation. It progressed through pontiffs and assemblies, through basilicas and tribunals. But the Kebra Nagast originated from a separate realm. A realm where sacred elements were preserved not behind polished stone, but within caverns sung in devotion, protected by monastics who couldn't decipher Latin and wouldn't genuflect to papal authority. When the Jesuits initially encountered the manuscript in the 17th century, they corresponded homeward with a combination of amazement and apprehension. One characterized it as a reflection of the Old Testament with its distinct identity. Another, more guarded, labelled it perilously autonomous. The expression signified it existed independently, beyond Vatican governance. That was the authentic menace the manuscript had been duplicated manually for successive generations. It wasn't mass-manufactured, not published in European territories, and yet it had persisted. Its persistence alone represented a subtle confrontation, a murmur in the shadows declaring, Rome isn't the singular guardian of truth. By the moment the Latin rendering arrived at the Vatican, it was handled as a novelty, not a doctrinal matter. Formally, the Church never reacted, but informally, intellectuals were cautioned against referencing it. It wasn't to be instructed in theological institutions, not to be referenced in correspondence, and most critically, not to be contrasted with the authorized Western biblical texts. But quietness cannot eliminate a narrative, and the more discreetly it was interred, the more influence it appeared to possess. In the early 1900s, a faculty member at the Pontifical Gregorian University commenced teaching from the Kebra Nagast. Within 12 months, his presentations were terminated, his documentation confiscated, and his identity erased from subsequent records. No justification was provided, only a reassignment to a smaller position in rural areas. Years afterward, he inscribed in a confidential correspondence, The manuscript is hazardous only to those frightened of history. That's what the Vatican dreaded most. Not that the Kebra Nagast was incorrect, but that it was accurate, that it described a sacred descent never interrupted, that it positioned the Ark of the Covenant in the custody of another population, that it presented a narrative without Rome, and therefore the manuscript was never incinerated, never openly contested, only interred in the quietness between the storage spaces, still existing, still anticipating. The correspondence was never intended to be discovered. It possessed no official marking, no heading, and no recorded date. Yet it displayed the unmistakable penmanship of a pontiff, and the subtle fragrance of aged parchment still adhered to its perimeters. It was uncovered in the year 1972 by a youthful archivist named Matteo, deep within a compartment that hadn't been accessed in numerous decades. The inscription had diminished, but the communication persisted. The correspondence commenced with subtle urgency. There's a narrative developing in the highlands of Ethiopia. It brings with it identities we've eliminated and a truth we elected not to claim. If we don't respond promptly, we'll no longer maintain the ability to disregard it. The authentication at the conclusion, though partially obscured, corresponded with documented penmanship specimens from Pope Pius XI. He had presided from 1922 until his passing in 1939, a period when the Church existed between ancient dominions and emerging powers, trapped in the uncertain quietness between conflicts. It was equally a period when the Vatican's attention toward Africa had expanded rapidly and deliberately. What disturbed the Pope, as the correspondence clarified, wasn't military or governmental instability. It was the expanding impact of the Kebra Nagast and its audacious assertion that Ethiopia maintained the authentic descent of Solomon. Even more troubling, from the Vatican's perspective, was the conviction that Ethiopia had preserved the Ark of the Covenant concealed in obvious view. The correspondence expressed dread. Not the dread of aggression, but of a confrontation to Rome's ethical legitimacy. If this conviction propagates, the Pope inscribed, it will fracture the basis of our assertion to universal truth. We won't maintain the ability to declare we are the primary nor the exclusive. That was the predicament. The Vatican couldn't openly refute the Kebra Nagast without attracting notice to it, but it equally couldn't embrace it without dismantling ages of meticulously protected chronicles. And therefore the Pope provided subtle directions to postpone additional publication of the manuscript in European tongues, to counsel missionaries to evade open examination of Solomon's descent, and most critically, to observe any endeavours to introduce Ethiopian doctrine into formal ecclesiastical assemblies. It wasn't a directive inscribed in fury, but in prudence, as if the Pope perceived that excessive illumination might grant vitality to the shadows. The unexpected development emerged many years afterward. Matteo, the archivist who discovered the correspondence, perished under peculiar conditions. He was youthful, vigorous, and possessed no documented affliction. He collapsed one daybreak outside the Vatican Library, grasping a container of handwritten documentation. The container vanished. The correspondence was discreetly restored to the compartment, and the compartment was secured once more. To this present day, the Church has never acknowledged that such a correspondence exists. But within the chambers of the Apostolic Archive, there are murmurs that even a pontiff once experienced dread. The narrative maintained in the sheets of a manuscript that Rome never composed, and that dread still remains, subtle as flame glow. In the year 1624, a modest assembly of Jesuit clergy departed Rome under the Pope's endorsement. Their objective was straightforward, at least formally: to reinforce connections with the Ethiopian Church and tenderly direct it toward complete communion with the Vatican. But underneath the exterior, the intention was far more sensitive. They had been directed to examine the developing speculations surrounding the Kebra Nagast, the Ark of the Covenant, and the alleged descent of Solomon. Still present in Ethiopia's sovereign court, they journeyed in secrecy, attired not in the vivid crimson of cardinals, but in simple garments and footwear. Their commander, Father Antonio Fernandez, was recognized for his composed disposition and profound allegiance to the Church. He had devoted years examining Eastern liturgical practices and was selected for this objective because of his talent for influence. But as they travelled deeper into the Ethiopian plateaus, something transformed. The correspondences ceased arriving, the accounts diminished, and ultimately quietness descended like granite. For beyond 12 months the Vatican received nothing. Then, without forewarning, a solitary messenger materialized at the entrances of the Apostolic Palace. He wasn't a Jesuit. He was a Portuguese trader who had previously exchanged commodities along the Red Sea coastline. His communication was concise. They won't be returning. The Vatican responded with a solitary acknowledgement of appreciation. No examination ensued, no identities were inscribed to the chambers of commemoration. The complete objective was simply eliminated, but murmurs persisted. One of them emerged decades afterward from a surviving Ethiopian document smuggled into Alexandria by a monastic escaping civil turbulence. It portrayed a discussion conducted in a granite sanctuary beneath the highlands where 5 foreign clergy disputed against the content of the Kebra Nagast. The manuscript doesn't identify the clergy, but it states one of them shed tears when he received the chanting of Ge'ez spoken above the ark. If the narrative holds truth, then the Jesuit objective didn't disappear in brutality. It wasn't eliminated to disease or warfare. It was shattered by disclosure. They had travelled seeking falsehood and discovered something they couldn't refute. One handwritten account from the year 1687, long interred in a peripheral collection of the Vatican Library, contains a mysterious statement. It states, "There are truths which, after witnessed, destroy the individuals who witness them. Ethiopia possesses one such truth." In Rome, the narrative was never recounted. But in the slopes of Lalibela, monastics still discuss visitors who arrived with foreign devotions, remained for a duration, and abandoned their Latin behind. They're remembered not as adversaries, but as individuals who attended. And maybe that's why the Vatican never dispatched another objective of that nature again. Not because the initial one collapsed, but because it succeeded in a manner nobody anticipated. A success that alarmed the Church more than any collapse. A subtle capitulation inscribed not in inscription, but in quietness. Deep in the plateaus of northern Ethiopia, there's a location where granite doesn't ascend toward the heavens, but descends into the ground. A location where sanctuaries weren't constructed, but sculpted, cut directly into the bedrock manually, in quietness. No framework, no lumber, just instrument, mallet and devotion. The settlement is designated Lalibela, and for ages its very presence has disturbed the Vatican. There are 11 sanctuaries in Lalibela, each one fashioned from a solitary block of volcanic granite, excavated from the summit downward. Barriers, platforms, supports, apertures, all sculpted inside the ground like chambers recalled from a vision. The craftsmanship is so accurate, so extraordinary, that some early European travellers declined to accept it was accomplished by mortal labour, but it was. According to Ethiopian heritage, the sanctuaries were commissioned by King Lalibela in the 12th century, after he obtained a vision of Jerusalem during banishment. Celestial beings, the narrative states, directed the labourers, and each darkness, while the individuals rested, the celestial beings continued the craftsmanship. Within 24 years, the sanctuaries stood completed, concealed in obvious view. The Vatican initially learned of Lalibela through the accounts of Portuguese missionaries in the 16th century. What they portrayed made their superiors troubled. It wasn't merely the construction, it was the ceremonies. Ethiopian clergy chanted in Ge'ez, ignited incense in subterranean chapels and conducted liturgical practices older than anything performed in European territories. And underneath it all there was something even more disturbing, a configuration from overhead. The arrangement of the sanctuaries formed a design not arbitrary, not unintentional, a symbolic representation, some accepted, replicating both Jerusalem and the heavenly arrangement portrayed in the Book of Enoch. That identical manuscript the Vatican had long dismissed. When one Jesuit returned to Rome with illustrations of the location, he was directed not to release them. His documentation was seized, his observations discreetly disregarded, and yet they still exist, handwritten and diminished, interred in the Vatican's restricted construction collection. The authentic, unexpected development emerged years afterward when a Vatican archaeologist operating under a separate project designation visited Lalibela in the year 1964. He was there to examine the construction techniques, or so the formal narrative proceeded. But his confidential documentation, revealed only after his passing, communicate another account. He asserted he discovered inscriptions inside the sanctuary barriers, emblems that corresponded not Latin but primordial Hebrew and Coptic. He portrayed a concealed compartment beneath one of the chapels, secured with a panel that possessed no evident method to elevate. And in his concluding documentation he inscribed something that has puzzled investigators ever since. It's not that these sanctuaries were sculpted in granite, it's that they were sculpted from recollection. The Vatican never addressed his discoveries, but no additional expeditions were dispatched. In Lalibela, the quietness persists. The atmosphere contains the scent of frankincense and frigid granite. Devotees proceed unshod through confined channels, murmuring devotions in a tongue older than Rome. And the sanctuaries, sculpted in secrecy, continue to maintain their enigma, not above the ground, but below it, where even illumination must curve. There are inscriptions in the granite, sculpted deep into the barriers of Lalibela's sanctuaries, engraved into supports, illustrated onto documents, sewn into aged garments. They manifest simple initially: a celestial body, a crucifix, a blaze. But the longer you observe, the more they commence to transform, not in design, but in significance. Because these aren't ornamentations, they're communications, and some of them the Vatican cannot clarify. When Jesuit missionaries initially proceeded through the sanctuaries of Ethiopia in the 16th century, they anticipated to discover fragmented traces of Christian truth. What they discovered instead was something comprehensive and unfamiliar. The emblems covering the barriers weren't like the ones in Rome. There were no aureoles of precious metal, no Latin engravings. Instead, there were crucifixes with 12 extremities, spheres inside celestial bodies, winged entities with 6 visual organs, and peculiar script inscribed in flowing curves. They inquired the clergy what the emblems signified. The responses were subtle. Some were too sacred to clarify. Others were older than recollection itself. Back in Rome, illustrations of these emblems were positioned into secured containers and contributed to the confidential archives. Over the subsequent 3 ages, various intellectuals attempted to interpret them. One accepted they were acquired from primordial Jewish mysticism. Another maintained they originated from the early Egyptian church, concealed during the persecutions of the Roman Empire. A third asserted they corresponded configurations witnessed in the Book of Enoch, emblems connected to the observers. But none of these responses resolved the matter, because with every endeavour to clarify, more inquiries ascended. In the year 1928, a Vatican librarian named Father Gianni was authorized rare entrance to a collection of Ethiopian documents. These manuscripts had been obtained discreetly, not registered, not exhibited. One volume in particular attracted his consideration. It contained a listing of emblems, each one succeeded by a sequence of Ge'ez manuscript, and what manifested to be a collection of directions. One emblem, 3 interconnected spheres surrounding a solitary blaze, was designated with a term Father Gianni had never witnessed. He transmitted a duplicate to the Department for the Doctrine of the Faith. Weeks afterward, he was reassigned. The manuscript vanished from the storage space. Decades afterward, an investigator in France examining early Christian symbolism, asserted he had discovered the identical emblem sculpted into a barrier beneath the Vatican near the primordial necropolis beneath St. Peter's Basilica. When he petitioned entrance to contrast photographs, he was refused no clarification, merely a correspondence stating the territory was experiencing restoration. But in Lalibela, the emblems persist untouched. Devotees still contact them with their extremities before devotion. Monastics still illustrate them in the borders of their handwritten manuscripts. They aren't interrogated, they're entrusted. In the West, an emblem must be rendered to possess significance in Ethiopia. An emblem only necessitates being recalled, and that's the enigma the Vatican cannot clarify. These inscriptions in granite don't communicate to Rome. They communicate to something older, something more profound, a truth transmitted not through assemblies or papal proclamations, but through quietness, motion, and conviction. Beneath the crimson ground of northern Ethiopia, there's a passage limited individuals discuss. It doesn't manifest on formal representations, it's not referenced in travel publications or ecclesiastical records. Yet it exists, sculpted from granite, secured in shadows, and stated to connect two realms that were never intended to encounter. The corridor was initially uncovered in the year 1931 by an assembly of indigenous cultivators near the periphery of Lalibela. They were excavating for a water channel during an extended arid duration when one individual's implement contacted emptiness. What they revealed was not a cavern, but a confined passageway descending at a flawless inclination into the ground. It was bordered with level barriers, engraved faintly with deteriorated engravings. In Ge'ez, there were no ascents, no entrances, only the reverberation of their movements as they entered. Information of the uncovering reached the indigenous clergy, who immediately commanded the territory secured. But before that occurred, one inquisitive youth, the offspring of a trader, crept inside with a flame in grasp. He pursued the corridor for nearly half a distance, his blaze flickering against moist granite. What he discovered at the termination would transform the manner he perceived his conviction forever. The passage accessed into a modest concealed compartment beneath an ages-old monastery. Inside it existed a solitary granite platform. Upon it, enveloped in particles, was a leather-secured manuscript. It wasn't in Ge'ez, it was in Latin. The unexpected development emerged when the youth, now a mature individual, communicated his narrative decades afterward to a French chronicler. According to him, the manuscript contained documentation from a European traveller. Not a missionary, but an intellectual. An individual who had arrived to Ethiopia not to transform, but to examine, and who had never departed. In the borders of the sheets, this individual had inscribed about primordial ceremonies he had observed. He portrayed them as recognizable, too recognizable. He documented the similarities between Ethiopian and early Roman liturgical practices. The identical emblems, the identical devotions, even the identical configuration of the ceremony. But the most astonishing documentation was at the very termination. I accept this passage once connected our two sanctuaries, before the assemblies, before the separation, before the quietness. Back in the Vatican, the presence of the passage was never recognized, but in 1974, a petition was discreetly made by the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples to transmit a confidential assembly to Lalibela. The petition was refused by the Ethiopian Church. They stated the corridor was sacred, not to be examined, only to be recalled. The Vatican didn't insist the matter. To this present day, the entrance to the corridor persists secured by granite and enveloped by vegetation. But among the older clergy of Lalibela, there's a declaration. They don't communicate it audibly, only in devotion. The church was never separated by territory, only by recollection. And deep underneath the ground, concealed from the visual organs of pontiffs and sovereigns, there may still exist a portal between convictions, sculpted not in domination, but in harmony. A corridor that chronicles neglected, but the granites didn't. The intellectual's identity was Father Emilio d'Alba, a subtle individual with acute visual organs and a presence seldom elevated above a murmur. He was a Vatican-trained linguist, proficient in Latin, Greek and Hebrew, but in his concluding years it was the primordial tongue of Ethiopia, Ge'ez, that absorbed his every consideration. In the year 1969, the Vatican transmitted him to Ethiopia under the pretext of a liturgical examination. His formal responsibility was to contrast Ethiopian Christian chanting to early Roman hymns, to trace common origins and maybe tenderly foster doctrinal alignment. But those who recognised him stated his attention operated more profound. He wasn't there to align heritages. He was there to comprehend why they had separated at all. Father Emilio resided for nearly 5 years in the plateau monastery of Debre Damo, one of the most ancient in Ethiopia. Isolated from pathways accessible only by cord up a cliffside barrier, the monastery was a location of quietness and dedication. But underneath the devotions, the incense, and the granite chambers, something else activated. He maintained a record, inscribed in confidentiality by flame glow. He documented sounds of unfamiliar chanting, made illustrations of emblems sculpted into the barriers, and rendered manuscripts the Vatican had never witnessed. The monastics entrusted him. They accepted he wasn't there to transform them, and for the initial moment Father Emilio experienced like he was no longer merely examining a heritage. He was accessing it. Then emerged the concluding entry. It was inscribed on a severed sheet, compressed and concealed inside the interior of his travel container, uncovered only after his passing. The penmanship was unsteady, and there were shadowy marks along the perimeters, as if inscribed in urgency. This daybreak, I was presented the manuscript, not a duplicate, not a retelling. The manuscript itself, secured in shadowy crimson leather, too ancient to determine age, with sheets that released the fragrance of frankincense. The monastics designated it the Recollection of Blaze. They state it's not to be examined, only received, and therefore they vocalized it to me. A liturgical practice not discovered in any Vatican archive. The terms arrived like atmosphere through granite. It communicates of a period when all sanctuaries were unified, before tongues separated us, before authority occupied positions of power. It recounts of a covenant not shattered, only relocated. And, in the border, a solitary expression inscribed in both Ge'ez and Latin. The ark was never eliminated, only concealed. That was the final sequence he ever inscribed. 3 days afterward, he was discovered alone, genuflecting beside a precipice, extremities compressed in devotion. There were no indications of conflict, no affliction, just quietness. The Vatican retrieved his body, but made no reference of his craftsmanship. His record, aside from the concluding sheet, was never restored, and the monastics of Debre Damo provided no clarification, only a simple benediction. In Ge'ez, some accept he discovered harmony. Others accept he discovered something more. A truth too profound for Rome, too sacred for sheet. And maybe that's what alarmed the Vatican most. Not that he eliminated his conviction, but that he discovered it. The initial element you detect is the fragrance. Before your visual organs accommodate to the shadows, before your auditory organs capture the subtle rhythm of primordial chanting, the aroma reaches you, pleasant, smoky and acute, frankincense combusting gradually in a bronze vessel, oscillating tenderly from the extremity of an unshod priest. Below that, even deeper, even more ancient, rises the aroma of hewn rock, heated by ages of human breath and devotion. In Ethiopia's mountain sanctuaries, everything moves slowly. The stone walls stand massive and cool, carved straight from living mountains. Illumination comes not from coloured windows, but from thin slashes carved into bedrock, gentle and amber. darkness shifts like flowing liquid. Forever, the atmosphere maintains this holy mixture of vapour and granite, history and enigma. European academics who make the journey frequently mention a sensation of departing from temporal reality. Yet for the clergy dwelling here, temporal reality never departed. The sacred words they recite every dawn remain unchanged since centuries before Rome established its official texts. The language flows in Ge'ez, a tongue the Vatican once examined but never completely understood. The tempo is deliberate, the tones are deep. They don't ascend to create impact. They vibrate like bedrock under your souls. A visiting prelate from Italy during 1961 remained 3 nights at a religious house near Aksum. He received welcome, courteously viewed the sanctuary and joined in devotions. Initially, he found himself puzzled by the absence of benches, the bare surfaces, the aged sacred images blackened by generations of flame. Then, transformation occurred. Throughout a midnight service, a youth barely 12 advanced toward the sacred table bearing a tiny container of smoking incense. As the prelate subsequently recorded in an unpublished letter, the young one moved without shoes in absolute stillness save for the vessel's sound. In that instant I sensed the vapour bearing more than fragrance. It transported something primeval, something authentic. He departed for Rome and never discussed publicly his experience. The revelation, like numerous Vatican enigmas, exists not in the occurrence itself, but in subsequent developments. Shortly afterward, his identity disappeared from a group addressing liturgical modification. His documents were discreetly archived. The aroma of frankincense, so prevalent in his recollections, gave way to the refined marble of St. Peter's Basilica. Yet in Ethiopia's rock sanctuaries, nothing shifted. The clergy still rise before first light. The incense still ignites from embers transferred every dawn. The devotions ascend gradually, like vapour seeking heaven. No documentation exists of these instances. No photography is permitted. Still those who have witnessed that stone quietness bear it eternally, not as memorabilia, but as confidence. For in that smell, frankincense and granite, exists something beyond ceremonial. It is the aroma of a narrative older than Rome, smouldering quietly in darkness, where language fails and only remembrance persists. In every magnificent cathedral, in every monastic archive, in every hushed chapel where manuscripts turn beneath candle glow, one inquiry resonates louder than any chime. What constitutes canon? Who makes determinations? Canon represents more than a catalogue of volumes. It is the barrier between authenticity and false teaching, between what endures and what vanishes. It is the authorized expression of a belief system inscribed in ink and defended by authority. Yet behind that expression others have eternally existed, murmuring from obscurity, questioning if the canon stands complete. In the Western world, biblical canons solidified during the Trent Council in the 1500s. It marked a period of turmoil. Protestant revolutionaries challenged established doctrines, producing Bibles in everyday tongues and eliminating volumes they labelled secondary. The Vatican answered with resolve. It established a boundary in ink, proclaiming definitively which volumes held sanctity and which did not. Yet rarely acknowledged is that this determination arrived belatedly. Across more than a millennium, various Christian communities regarded different manuscripts as divine. Some embraced the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and even Gospels narrating stories of Mary and additional early followers. The Ethiopian Church, practicing Christianity long before the Trent Council, retained numerous these volumes. They continue to preserve them. Here the enigma commences. When Jesuit academics initially travelled to Ethiopia, they anticipated discovering a diminished form of Christianity. Instead, they encountered something more ancient. Their guides possessed substantial leather-bound Bibles inscribed in Ge'ez, containing volumes Rome had long rejected. These manuscripts weren't incorporated subsequently. They existed from inception. The tension became evident. If Ethiopia preserved these manuscripts from Christianity's earliest periods, might it be that the Vatican eliminated them? One correspondence composed in 1694 by a Jesuit priest expressed his unease after examining the Book of Enoch. If this manuscript holds truth, then celestial beings have descended and humanity has retained knowledge. Rome has no accommodation for such recollections. That correspondence remained unpublished. It remains currently in a locked envelope within the Vatican's storage. Yet Ethiopia persisted unshaken. The revelation transcends mere historical significance. It becomes intimate. Canon concerns not solely which volumes are studied. It concerns who controls the narrative. When the Vatican established its canon, it wasn't merely designating sacred manuscripts, it was suppressing alternatives. In Ethiopia, the canon isn't a barrier, but an entrance. It encompasses narratives of descended celestial beings, concealed understanding, and visions extending beyond celestial bodies. These aren't dismissed, they're welcomed. That's why the inquiry holds such profound significance. What constitutes canon? Who makes determinations? For occasionally the most perilous truths are those excluded. Within those abandoned manuscripts, an entirely different chronicle awaits rediscovery. Church history isn't solely inscribed in volumes, it's inscribed in flames. For every manuscript meticulously maintained in the Vatican Library, others were incinerated, concealed, or disappeared. Some vanished through temporal passage, others vanished intentionally. In the initial centuries following Christ, the Church possessed no established Bible. Various communities studied different Gospels. Some possessed Paul's epistles. Others followed manuscripts like the Book of Enoch, the Shepherd of Hermas, and the Gospel of Mary. In Egyptian deserts and Ethiopian highlands, faithful copied these compositions manually, trusting spiritual guidance. Yet in Rome, new authority emerged, accompanied by apprehension. Apprehension that excessive voices would fragment truth. Apprehension that enigma would become disorder. Apprehension that narratives beyond governance would ignite inquiries no pontiff could resolve. Consequently, determinations occurred. At the Laodicea Council in the 4th century and subsequently at the Carthage Council, ecclesiastical authorities commenced forming the canon. Particular volumes received acclaim. Others quietly disappeared. By the Trent Council in the 1500s, the catalogue was finalised, and all external manuscripts were designated apocrypha, or worse, false teaching. Numerous these dismissed volumes disappeared from Europe, yet in Ethiopia they endured. That's what renders the Ethiopian Bible so threatening in Vatican perspective. It's not merely ancient, it's comprehensive. It retains what others attempted to eliminate. A Jesuit priest positioned in the Ethiopian highlands during 1673 composed a document that never arrived in Rome. It was located years subsequently in a locked container. Within, he depicted a sacred ceremony where religious brothers recited sections from the Book of Jubilees. He felt astonished witnessing the assembly respond with complete familiarity of the manuscript, as though transmitted from ancestor to descendant. He inscribed, "These aren't insurgents, they are custodians of what we surrendered." Their devotions bear resonances we previously silenced. That quietness didn't invariably arrive peacefully. In France, throughout the Albigensian Crusade, complete archives burned because they possessed compositions labelled unorthodox. In Spain, throughout the Inquisition, duplicates of Gospels considered fraudulent were confiscated and eliminated. In Italy, particular manuscripts were secured in monasteries with directives never to render them, yet the revelation is even within the Vatican's personal storage. Some of these allegedly prohibited volumes still remain. Not exhibited, not for examination, solely retained. Some bear crimson wax closures. Others display cautions in Latin, non videre, non legere, refrain from observing. refrain from studying. Still, flames never touched Ethiopia. The volumes were maintained. Presently, centuries afterward, they provide a different illumination. Not a blaze that consumes, but one that discloses a reminder that occasionally the most threatening action a volume can perform is persist. She stood present at inception, at the execution site, at the vacant sepulchre in the gathering chamber, where wind stirred without caution. Mary Magdalene, whose identity was mentioned in every region of the primitive church, she exceeded mere observer. Some named her the Apostle to Apostles. Still, in Rome's extensive register of divine manuscripts, her expression gradually diminished until it disappeared, yet not universally. In Ethiopia's highlands, secured in a monastery untouched by temporal passage, a solitary volume persisted. Its manuscripts were manually bound, its ink diminished with age, yet its communication clear. It constituted a gospel, not of Peter, not of John, but of Mary. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene never entered the canon selected by the Vatican. It was among the volumes that alarmed primitive church authorities not for its content, but for its author. In this Gospel, Mary doesn't remain quietly in the periphery. She articulates, she instructs, she reveals visions of the Spirit's passage beyond mortality. She faces challenge not from adversaries, but from fellow followers. Peter, in one section, inquires why Jesus would address a woman privately and not address them collectively. Mary responds serenely, not with authority, but with tranquility. Her expression contains no fury, solely grief, as though she already comprehends her narrative will be eliminated. The Vatican has never formally recognized this gospel. Across centuries, it was considered disappeared, persisting solely in portions discovered in desert caverns. Yet in the early 1900s, a duplicate inscribed in Ge'ez was located in an isolated Ethiopian monastery near Lake Tana. This edition was more extensive, more complete, and unlike the European portions, it had been vocalized in ceremonies for generations. A Jesuit missionary named Father Lucien was the initial outsider to witness it. He inscribed in his chronicle, "They discuss Mary as one discusses Paul, not as an assistant, but as an establisher. Her expressions aren't embellishment, they are groundwork." He transmitted a petition to the Vatican to examine the manuscript further. The answer arrived swiftly. His deployment concluded. He was summoned to Rome and never dispatched on expedition again. The manuscript itself remained untaken. The religious brothers declined to surrender it. They designated it the expression beneath the quietness. For them, Mary wasn't eliminated. She was retained. In every melody sung by candle glow, in every narrative transmitted from ancestor to offspring, she constituted part of their belief's groundwork. Perhaps that's the enigma Rome cannot resolve. In its archives, the Gospel of Mary exists solely in portions. In Ethiopia, it thrives. An expression previously silenced by assemblies now articulates from mountain surfaces and midnight devotions, not with authority's thunder, but with truth's gentleness. Within that gentle expression, something threatening still remains, not insurgency, but remembrance. In the Vatican's hushed corridors, where marble surfaces resonate beneath lengthy garments and oil flames waver against primeval surfaces, exists a truth almost too delicate to articulate openly. The Bible as civilization comprehends it currently was not solely rendered, it was reconstructed. The term reconstruct generates discomfort. Yet in the Church's primitive centuries, Scripture wasn't singular, but numerous scrolls. Narratives of Jesus, of apostles, of celestial beings and visions, travelled across deserts, mountains and oceans, duplicated manually, transmitted from spirit to palm, never identical twice. The primitive Christians weren't compilers, they were gatherers of marvel. Yet as the Church expanded, so did its apprehension of disorder. Excessive voices, excessive editions, endangered the governance that Rome had commenced. Collecting, the requirement for structure-generated assemblies, congregations of prelates who disputed not solely theology, but which expressions should endure eternally and which should quietly disappear. By the Trent Council in the 1500s, the Bible was proclaimed sealed. No additional modifications, no additional supplements, no additional wandering gospels. It was secured with authority and protected with flames. Yet what preceded that closure? In the 4th century, a scholar named Jerome received assignment from the Pope to produce a solitary, authoritative edition of Scripture. Operating from Hebrew, Greek, and earlier Latin manuscripts, he formed what would become the Vulgate, the Roman Bible's foundation. Yet Jerome didn't merely render. He made determinations. He reorganized volumes. He excluded some. He included annotations with cautions. He designated the Book of Enoch threatening. He designated the Shepherd of Hermas fabrication. His selections, made in his chamber's quietness, would resonate across centuries. The Vatican never concealed this chronicle. It merely never emphasized it. In Ethiopia, circumstances differed. Their Bible was never reconstructed to correspond with the West. It persisted substantial, unusual and divine. It retained Enoch, retained Jubilees, retained Mary's Gospel and others long eliminated by Rome. It wasn't reduced to accommodate assemblies. It was defended like living remembrance. One Vatican academic operating in the storage during 1971 located a collection of manually inscribed observations inserted into an aged Latin Bible. They originated from a prelate in the 1200s who had previously encountered an Ethiopian religious brother during a pilgrimage. In the border he inscribed, "Their Bible is untamed, yet it burns with authenticity. Ours is refined, theirs thrives." That observation remained unpublished. Perhaps that's the most profound enigma of all. Not what remained incorporated, but what was excluded. Not which narratives endured, but who determined they should. The Bible's reconstruction wasn't a solitary action. It was a quiet conflict, fought with ink, secured by authority and retained solely in murmurs. Still in Ethiopia, the more ancient narrative still proceeds barefoot and unmodified through belief's manuscripts. That's what Rome apprehends most. Not falsehoods, but the authenticity it selected to eliminate. In Ethiopia's scorching lowlands, distant from Lalibella's rock sanctuaries and any cardinal's observation, exist caverns the Vatican has never penetrated. These caverns don't resonate with chimes or ceremonies. They respire with quietness. Within them, secured behind improvised rock barriers and deteriorated goatskin draperies, rest the volumes civilization was never intended to witness. Across centuries, desert religious brothers have withdrawn to these caverns, not to abandon civilization, but to protect it. They bear no armaments. They accept no pledges of magnificence. What they defend is more ancient than precious metal and more threatening than blades. They defend expressions. These volumes aren't retained in archives. They're enclosed in fabric, inserted into rock fissures, and transmitted through generations with murmured directives. Never exchange, never duplicate, never disclose. Each volume narrates a different narrative. One discusses celestial beings who instructed humanity to inscribe prohibited understanding. Another depicts the primitive periods of Mary Magdalene's expedition in Egypt. Exist scrolls detailing visions of heaven splitting open, disclosing not condemnation but remembrance. During 1932, a European investigator traversing the Danakil Depression received refuge from a desert religious brother during a sandstorm. The religious brother, a figure with eyes like eroded granite, provided liquid and a caution. Refrain from inquiring about the volumes. The investigator, motivated by inquisitiveness, inquired regardless. Subsequently that evening, the religious brother produced a small, darkened volume enclosed in palm foliage. He didn't open it. He merely stated, "This one wasn't inscribed on earth." It was retained in memory. The investigator documented this instant in his chronicle. He transmitted the observations to an institution in France where they accumulated dust for decades. Subsequently, they attracted the Vatican's notice. A discreet investigation was initiated. No formal answer was ever provided. The revelation arrived in 1977 when a Vatican keeper named Father Borgia inscribed an unpublished correspondence to an associate, stating that a collection of unclassified manuscripts from Ethiopia had emerged in Rome. The inscription was Ge'ez. The substance, he maintained, reflected portions of the Book of Noah considered disappeared eternally. Yet the revelation wasn't in what the volumes stated. It was in what they didn't state. There was no reference to Peter, no reference to Rome. Solely a quiet, transparent expression articulating through centuries of sand and concealment. An expression that didn't seek authorization. An expression that never requested canonization. The Vatican didn't verify the existence of those manuscripts, yet since then, no additional expeditions have been sanctioned in the Danakil territory. Formally, the caverns possess no ecclesiastical significance. Still, the religious brothers persist. Their flames still illuminate. The volumes, secured from pontiffs and academics alike, rest where they were initially positioned. Not behind transparent barriers, but in granite's embrace. Not disappeared, not eliminated, solely anticipating. In the initial months of 1625, beneath the expanding lunar phases, shadow and drawn draperies' quietness, a secured directive was delivered to a Jesuit named Father Matteo Serrano. He wasn't a renowned academic, not an elevated cardinal. He was selected for a different rationale: his compliance. The expedition was evident, though never articulated openly. Journey to the Ethiopian highlands, locate the theological division's origin, and, if required, rectify it. The correspondence he transported bore no emblem, solely a scarlet wax closure stamped with a cross. Unlike any utilised in Rome, it was intended to be opened solely after travelling beyond familiar chart's reach. Even among his Jesuit associates, the expedition was referenced solely by its designation, Lux Caecus, the unseeing illumination. Father Matteo arrived in Massawa by ocean, then proceeded inland by animal, pursuing a route worn thin by traders and pilgrims. He maintained isolation, inscribing lengthy observations in a leather chronicle inserted within his garments. When questioned what he was performing in Ethiopia, he answered solely examining the illumination. Yet it wasn't illumination that attracted him. It was a volume, one rumoured to possess sections not located in any Western canon. A volume allegedly contradicting Rome's comprehension of the Trinity. A volume the Vatican desired either retrieved or eliminated. The inhabitants were distrustful. They had witnessed figures like him previously. Some arrived with blessings, others with flames. In the village of Adwa, Father Matteo received refuge in a granite monastery constructed against the mountain. The religious brothers there were considerate but reserved. They articulated in subdued tones and frequently disappeared for periods, returning with countenances marked by ash. There Father Matteo witnessed the volume, enclosed in hide, bordered with iron fasteners, its script inscribed in Ge'ez flowing like river liquid down the manuscript. He didn't comprehend the expressions, yet he comprehended the quietness that ensued. When the religious brothers turned the manuscripts, the revelation arrived not in what he located, but in what he sensed. In a correspondence never transmitted, located years subsequently in a forgotten Vatican receptacle, Father Matteo inscribed, "I was dispatched here to rectify a fraudulent gospel, yet what I have located is a gospel uninterrupted. They haven't surrendered Christ. They have retained him differently. He never departed. Some state he perished of illness. Others state he selected to remain, accepting a new identity and disappearing into monastic existence's rhythm. The Vatican documented the expedition as incomplete. The document closed without specification. Yet the Ethiopian religious brothers retain memory. Each year on the identical day he arrived, they illuminate a solitary flame in a chamber where no devotions are articulated openly. In that flame's radiance, the secured volumes manuscripts still turn. Not eliminated, not rectified, solely studied. The city of Axum was tranquil that dawn. The marketplace had not yet commenced, and the carved monuments stood like frozen titans beneath the pale Sunday. The passages maintained the aroma of coffee, soil, and incense, as they eternally had. Yet something was incorrect. At the eastern entrance, beneath a twisted fig, two figures anticipated. One wore the white garments of an Ethiopian religious brother, the other the dark cassock of a Vatican representative. They didn't articulate. Their gathering was not documented in any formal record. Yet what transferred between them transformed the destiny of both churches. The religious brother's identity has been surrendered to temporal passage. Some state he was a guardian of the Ark, a figure pledged to quietness and isolation. Others state he was previously a priest in Rome who disappeared during an expedition and reappeared years subsequently in the Ethiopian highlands, transformed and inscrutable. The Vatican representative was Father Aldo Marchesi, dispatched under direct directives to retrieve what he designated the disputed manuscripts. His expedition was to recover a small collection of manuscripts believed to possess editions of scripture long eliminated from the Western canon. Yet Father Marchesi had been cautioned. The Vatican wasn't solely concerned with theology. They apprehended something more profound. A primitive alliance secured in evident sight, a concept that the Church in Ethiopia wasn't a division of Rome, but its equivalent. In his unpublished observations recovered after his disappearance, Father Marchesi depicted a gathering conducted the evening before at a small granite sanctuary on the city's periphery. The religious brother had displayed to him a volume enclosed in fabric and secured with wax. Within were manuscripts of devotions unlike anything he'd studied. They discussed a period when heaven and earth were unified, when Christ proceeded not solely in Galilee but also along the Red Sea. The apostles' identities were different. The church's structure was different. There was no reference to Peter's supremacy, solely of unity, fractured. Then arrived the treachery. The subsequent day, the Vatican representative returned with two protectors and demanded the manuscript. The religious brother, still serene, declined. What transpired next was never completely narrated. Yet by sunset, the volume was absent. The sanctuary was secured, and Father Marchesi's protectors were witnessed departing with a secured container beneath substantial fabric. That evening the representative disappeared. Some stated he escaped back to Rome, dishonoured by what he had performed. Others murmured that he never departed Axum, that the volume he took was not what it appeared, that the religious brother's quietness was not submission but caution. The Vatican never recognised the occurrence. In formal documentation, Father Marchesi is catalogued as relocated without deployment. The secured container was never located. Yet in Axum, the intersection still retains memory. Inhabitants still position stones at the fig's base, not as indicators of grief, but as reminders that even where belief is substantial, confidence can fracture. Occasionally what is taken cannot be transported. In the Archivum Secretum's obscure regions, beneath dust layers and protected quietness, rests a receptacle with no identity. Within are documents folded precisely, enclosed in a diminished silk fastening. They aren't marked as formal correspondence, yet no closure, no answer. They are the correspondences never transmitted. The composer was Father Domenico Farina, a Jesuit academic previously positioned in Gondar during the late 1700s. His expedition, according to Vatican directives, was straightforward. Observe Ethiopian ceremonies and document back on doctrinal deviations. Yet what commenced as an academic assignment soon transformed into something else. The more duration he allocated among the priests and religious brothers of the Ethiopian church, the more uncertain he became of his personal objective. He commenced inscribing a sequence of unpublished correspondences addressed to the Jesuit order's superior general, recognized within ecclesiastical circles as the Black Pope. These weren't arid field documents, they were admissions. His expressions were cautious, yet there was a quiet desperation beneath the surface. He depicted liturgies that appeared more ancient than any Roman manuscript. He inscribed of children reciting psalms from volumes that had never been rendered into Latin. He discussed of icons that portrayed Christ with unfamiliar symbols, celestial bodies, wings, circles within circles. In one correspondence dated 5th March 1778, he inscribed, "I no longer maintain we were dispatched to rectify them. I maintain we were dispatched to prevent them from rectifying us." Yet here is the revelation. None of these correspondences were posted. They were located unopened in a container located behind a fraudulent panel in the Vatican's retention chambers during restorations in 1954. The container had been secured so intentionally that keepers initially maintained it was part of a forgotten surface. They expected worn translations or faded travel records when they pried it open. What they discovered instead was the trembling voice of a man whose faith had begun to fracture. A particular letter caught their attention. Wax sealed it shut, though no official mark pressed into the red surface. 3 crosses, intertwined, marked the seal instead. Father Domenico wrote of an encounter inside, a meeting with an Ethiopian priest of high standing, who revealed a single page from a manuscript the West believed lost forever. The Book of the Mysteries of the Heavens and the Earth. This priest insisted it had remained concealed since the 4th century. He told Father Domenico that Rome had stripped away certain realities and that Ethiopia had safeguarded them, not from terror, but from conviction. A single line closes the letter. If this reality ever surfaces, it won't come through debate, but through recognition. Why did these letters never reach their destination? Did someone silence Father Domenico? Or did he embrace silence willingly, understanding that certain realities resist explanation and demand only protection? The Vatican offered no statement regarding what was found. The satchel slipped back into storage without ceremony, filed away with no designation. Yet the letters persist, and through their quietness, a signal keeps resonating. Not one of uprising, not one of resistance, but something far more ancient. A voice that once spoke in devotion, now murmuring from history's forgotten corners. The atmosphere at Debre Libanos hung motionless that May morning, as though the world itself paused to listen. Carved into the cliffs north of Addis Ababa, the monastery had endured for generations as a sanctuary of contemplation, devotion, and remembrance. Yet in 1937, that stillness shattered, not with sacred sounds, but with the crack of rifles. The Italian control of Ethiopia had already delivered suffering across the region, but the events at Debre Libanos carved a scar so profound even historians struggle to revisit it. More than 2,000 monks, deacons and faithful gathered there for the yearly celebration of the monastery's establishment. Most arrived by foot, bringing nothing but conviction and simple provisions. Yet others were observing. Italian forces, following commands from General Pietro Maletti, encircled the location, claiming discovery of conspiracy, an alleged link between religious figures and an attack on the Italian viceroy. The Vatican during that period made no public acknowledgement. The church in Rome stayed mute even as the slaughter commenced. When evening fell, the green slopes surrounding Debre Libanos darkened with blood. The clergy, from aged monks to young novices, stood in rows and fell by the river flowing beneath the cliff edge. Their remains tumbled into the ravine, their identities never completely documented. But this is where the puzzle intensifies. 3 scribes died that day, who had been labouring on a particular codex, a handcrafted illuminated volume containing rare sections from the Book of Baruch, the Book of Tobit, and the Book of Enoch. The Codex allegedly held commentary penned by an unnamed Ethiopian theologian, describing European missionaries' arrival and cautioning against Rome's scriptural distortions. The Codex vanished without trace. The Vatican launched no official search to recover it. Years later, however, a letter emerged composed by a Red Cross volunteer who travelled to the area following the massacre. She described witnessing a soldier departing the scene with a wrapped package bound in leather and dusted with ash. When questioned about its contents, the soldier replied, "Merely a book, one they perished defending." The Vatican's records hold no formal acknowledgement of the massacre. Even in contemporary Vatican references to Ethiopian wartime events, Debre Libanos receives scant mention. Brief passages surface in internal documents tagged with terms like delicate and unverified, yet the Ethiopian Church holds memory. Each year the monks gather on that same soil, lighting flames not solely for those fallen, but for what disappeared. They maintain the Codex survives, concealed by one of the surviving novices, handed down in secrecy, not for vengeance, not for demonstration, but for safekeeping. Certain secrets rest beneath silence, others beneath bloodshed. The locomotive arrived in Rome as dawn approached. Dense fog wrapped the rails, shrouding the station in muffled stillness, as if the city hesitated before waking. Among the handful of travellers stepping onto the platform, one figure stood distinct. His coat showed tears, his bag hung threadbare, his collar, once rigid with dignity, now sagged under the burden of distance and quietness. Father Luca Benedetti was his name. 5 years had passed since his departure. Dispatched to Ethiopia by the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, Father Luca's assignment came described in uncertain yet pressing language. His objective, to forge new understanding with the Ethiopian Church, to clarify religious teaching, and most critically, to retrieve particular texts whispered to exist among remote clergy. The Vatican had grown troubled by rumours of alternative gospels, visions, and manuscripts still circulating beyond Rome's influence. They selected him for his compliance, not his inquisitiveness, not his courage, merely his devotion. Yet something transformed in those highlands. When Father Luca returned, no assembly welcomed him. No chimes rang from St. Peter's, no vehicle awaited. Just a solitary aide from the Vatican archives, clutching a message bearing one instruction: report to the congregation immediately. He never complied. Instead, he proceeded straight to his chambers near the Lateran Palace, where he drew the curtains and struck a single flame. He emptied his bag deliberately. Inside rested no volumes, no manuscripts, no documentation, only a small folded fabric. When he spread it open, a single vellum sheet dropped onto the surface. The script was J. Ez. At the base, a marking. 3 crosses circled together. He set it on the surface and studied it through the night. That evening he composed a message, not addressed to the Vatican but to a companion he'd trained with long ago. In the message he admitted something remarkable. "I departed to transform them," he recorded, "but transformation came to me instead. I discovered a faith not buried in ceremony but breathing in recollection. They preserve realities we've entombed beneath stone and procedure, and I worry. No. I recognise that if Rome witnessed what I witnessed, the foundations would fracture." The message never left his possession. It surfaced in his drawer years afterward. Following his passing, the Vatican never interrogated him. No conference ever appeared in records, no official declaration issued. He simply dissolved from view, assigned to an obscure clerical position in the city's periphery. A man who'd journeyed to history's boundary with no recognition, no victory, and one unspeakable truth. The revelation. When his chambers were emptied, That single vellum page had disappeared. And nobody, not the archivists, not the priests, not even the Swiss guards standing watch, could account for how the locked room had been breached. Sometimes power's greatest danger isn't force, it's testimony. High in northern Ethiopia's mountains, where oxygen thins and trees bend beneath persistent winds, rises a monastery older than recollection. They call it Abba Garima, honouring the saint who established it over a millennium past. Some claim he travelled from the east on foot. Others insist he descended from clouds during a tempest, clutching a volume that blazed in the downpour. The Vatican has recognised Abba Garima for generations. It surfaces in ancient mission documents as a location of significance, highlighted in crimson ink, yet never pursued. What elevates this place beyond folklore is a single manuscript, a codex so ancient experts suspect it may represent the earliest Christian text, still wearing its first binding. Its sheets catch light strangely, inscribed in Ge'ez, untouched by deterioration. But what genuinely disturbed the Vatican wasn't its antiquity. It was a vision, recorded in its closing passages with fading pigment, credited to Abba Garima himself. The vision describes an era when reality would travel not through monarchs or fortress walls, an era when the righteous scrolls would outlast the mighty cathedrals. It cautions of a distant church, wrapped in wealth and darkness, that would lose sight of Christ's face. When the Vatican first learned of the manuscript in 1958, they dispatched a group discreetly. Not an official mission, but 3 researchers. Under the guise of pilgrimage, they received instructions to examine the codex, confirm its legitimacy, and if circumstances permitted, negotiate its relocation to Rome for conservation. The monks declined. One researcher, a young Italian academic named Lorenzo Bellini, maintained a diary. In it, he recounts the instant he glimpsed the final sheet. The monks granted him one viewing. No gilt decoration appeared, no ornate designs, no attribution. Simply a phrase that stated, "The one who alters the word shall lose the word." That evening, the Vatican delegation departed without the manuscript. Yet Bellini never saw Italy again. 14 days later, he transmitted a message to his relations explaining he'd chosen to stay in Ethiopia. He wished to master the ancient language, traverse the paths of desert saints, and explore what he termed a more authentic memory. No further word came from him. The Vatican has never acknowledged the vision. It remains absent from official documentation. The name of Abba Garima rarely appears in ecclesiastical texts, except in passing reference. Still, deep in those mountains, the codex rests in a modest stone chamber wrapped in fabric, guarded by a solitary monk who refuses indoor sleep. They consider the vision not a caution. They regard it as a recognition that reality, once voiced, belongs not to those who dread it, but to those who transport it quietly through ages. In 1931, beneath the pale flicker of an oil flame, a British academic named Edward Mallory opened a timber chest in a hilltop monastery near Lake Tana. He'd arrived seeking chronicles, not wonders. Yet what he encountered that evening would haunt him forever. Inside the chest lay 3 manuscripts wrapped in aged linen layers, their borders curled and weathered from centuries of careful handling. The monks named them Eyes of the Night. Initially, Mallory assumed it was metaphorical language, but when the flame wavered and the chamber plunged into near blackness, something extraordinary occurred. The characters on the manuscripts began illuminating. It wasn't brilliant light, not an insect's flash or gold leaf's shimmer. It was gentler, like lunar rays on liquid. Each Ge'ez line appeared as though lit from beneath the ink, emitting a subtle azure glow that rippled across the parchment. Mallory, unsettled yet fascinated, questioned the monk beside him about the phenomenon. The elderly man grinned softly and replied, certain words weren't inscribed with ink. They were captured with luminescence. Mallory later documented this occurrence in his personal diary. The entry was never intended for distribution. He feared mockery or, worse, confiscation of the manuscripts. Yet years afterward, that diary reached a small library in Cambridge. There, in faded script, his observations told of 3 volumes unlike anything he'd witnessed across the Middle East, North Africa, or Europe. He recorded, "These aren't narratives, they're directions." Yet no description of their substance matches the sensation of standing beside them in darkness. The words appeared to pulse with life. Word of the luminous manuscripts quietly reached the Vatican through a Jesuit linguist positioned in Cairo. A petition was submitted to relocate the manuscripts to Rome for examination and conservation. The monks of Lake Tana refused, yet weeks afterward, during monsoon season, lightning struck the monastery. Portion of its archive chamber was obliterated. 2 monks died. The chest never emerged from the debris. That could have concluded the account. But here's the twist. In 1972, a visiting cardinal touring the Vatican Library mentioned something peculiar. He claimed witnessing a sealed glass container in a restricted hallway holding a manuscript that sparkled when illumination was extinguished. When he inquired about it, the archivist diverted conversation. No official registry of such a manuscript exists in the Vatican catalogue. Yet in a restricted storage zone known to merely a select few clerics, containers exist without identification, without markers, just shadow and stillness. To this moment, some suspect the manuscripts were never destroyed, that the Vatican did secure at least one, not for exhibition but for concealment, because if words can illuminate in darkness, perhaps they contain something beyond ink and recollection. Perhaps they contain the singular thing authority dreads most, reality that refuses extinction. In spring 1924, a rolled parchment reached the Vatican Library wrapped in goat hide and bound with braided reed cord. It carried no sender identification, only a notation tucked within the wrapping. Recovered near the Blue Nile's source. Do not rush translation. The manuscript passed from scholar to scholar, from one expert to another. At initial inspection, it resembled any typical Ethiopian document inscribed in Ge'ez, perhaps Sabaean. Yet when they unfurled the parchment and examined the symbols, discomfort spread through the chamber. It wasn't Ge'ez, it wasn't Hebrew, it wasn't Arabic, Aramaic, Latin, or Coptic. The script curved like climbing vines, yet matched no recognized alphabet. Certain characters floated above lines like vapor. Others spiraled inward, as though designed to be perceived, not with vision, but with spirit. For weeks, the Vatican's finest linguists laboured in quietness. They referenced ancient dictionaries and forgotten manuscripts, even contrasting it with mystical alphabets allegedly employed by early visionaries. Nothing yielded clarity. The line spacing suggested cadence, like chant or prayer. Still, no known language aligned. Cardinal Severino, leading the congregation for the doctrine of the faith during that period, personally visited the study chamber. After observing the manuscript, he commanded it sealed, but not before murmuring something to his assistant. If it resists reading, it wasn't intended for our eyes. Yet here the enigma deepens. In 1926, a Jesuit missionary named Father Auguste Lemaitre, stationed in Eritrea, reported witnessing a monk reading aloud from a manuscript bearing that identical script. He characterized the sound as eerie, musical and reverberating, though the reader barely whispered. When questioned about the language, the monk responded calmly, "It is the speech of those who existed before Babel." Father Lemaitre captured the moment in a private message dispatched to Rome, which was subsequently sealed and never released. Yet decades afterward, a researcher working in the Vatican's restricted archives discovered a portion of that message. The closing sentence stated, "I comprehended nothing, yet I wept." The twist arrived not in deciphering, but in visions. Multiple scholars who examined the manuscript closely began experiencing intense dreams. Images of crystalline cities, staircases ascending into clouds, and voices singing without language. One professor abandoned Rome entirely, withdrawing to a monastery in silence. Another disappeared during travel to Jerusalem. To this moment, the Vatican denies possessing any such manuscript. No documentation of the script appears in its public registry. Yet whispered among certain archivists is the conviction that the manuscript wasn't meant for deciphering because it doesn't address the intellect. It addresses the memory. Not the memory of one individual or even one civilization, but something more ancient. A language spoken before time maintained records, before narratives were inscribed, when reality passed from spirit to spirit, not sheet to sheet. In winter 1963, during an exceptionally frigid December, a container reached the Vatican from Addis Ababa. It displayed no diplomatic emblem, no official identification, simply a handwritten tag for the Archivum Secretum, handle with reverence. The container was modest, no larger than luggage, yet its contents would spark hushed discussions for generations. Inside rested a single volume, heavily bound in something that wasn't quite leather. The texture felt strange, pliable, yet not animal skin. The archivist who initially unwrapped it later characterized the sensation as flesh that recalled being animate. No title marked the cover, no symbol, no seal, only a faint discoloration. A shadow of a palm pressed into the binding as though someone long departed had touched it one final time. The Vatican initially classified it as Codex Obscura, Item 4, a temporary designation. Yet the scholars who examined it privately began naming it differently. The Flesh Gospel. Some insisted the sheets were fashioned from conventional parchment. Yet the cover presented another situation. A biologist from the University of Milan was quietly invited to analyse the material. She concluded that the genetic structure matched human tissue, potentially from several individuals. That conclusion was never disclosed publicly. Her laboratory was subsequently destroyed in a blaze. Nobody was injured, yet the original specimens were lost. Still, the enigma didn't conclude with the skin. Within the codex were texts possessing no established origin. They referenced narratives from the Book of Enoch, portions of apocalyptic visions and prayers inscribed in Ge'ez found in no other manuscript. One segment described a portal concealed in wilderness beyond, where angels no longer minister but observe. Another recounted the descent of entities from elevated realms, not fallen but dispatched to instruct, to caution, to witness. One specific section troubled the scholars most. It detailed a ceremony in which understanding is not read but consumed through contact. The reader must position their palm upon the cover and perceive not with hearing but with what the text termed the bone behind the breath. Nobody would confess to attempting it, yet one priest, a man named Father Roberto Sella, was discovered in his chamber days afterward, encircled by candles and scrawled sheets. He had inscribed the identical sentence repeatedly. It is not deceased. It is merely observing. The Vatican withdrew the codex from availability. It now resides in a climate-regulated vault beneath the Apostolic Palace. Officially, it doesn't exist. The container it arrived in was eliminated. The archivist who received it was transferred to a distant post in South America. Yet the legend persists. Some claim the volume was wrapped in human flesh, not to venerate the deceased, but to imprison what resided inside, that it is not merely a text, but a container, and that if it is ever opened completely, not with hands, but with conviction, it may communicate again. The question remains, to whom? In 1939, while the world outside descended into conflict, a quiet discovery occurred beneath the Vatican Library's marble floors. A monk named Brother Anselmo, tasked with restoring delicate manuscripts, received a bundle of aged parchment extracted from an unmarked container. The sheets were fragile, with age, yet strangely preserved by time. What captured his attention first wasn't the language, though it was Ge'ez, an ancient script few could still decipher, but the ink. It shimmered subtly, like fresh paint on stone. Though the sheets were reportedly over 1,000 years old, regardless of handling frequency, regardless of light or air exposure, the characters remained vivid. Not one mark had diminished. Brother Anselmo, a man trained in the gradual art of conservation, had never witnessed anything comparable. He termed it the ink that breathes. The Vatican's conservators analysed the manuscript under magnification, seeking explanations. The ink held no trace of iron, oak, gall, or carbon. When examined, it behaved oddly, glowing under candlelight, yet appearing dull under sunlight. And at night, if abandoned alone in blackness, the sheets emitted a subtle azure luminescence, as if they retained memory of being read. One segment in particular attracted immediate focus. A brief phrase inscribed in larger script than the remainder, 5 words positioned centrally on the sheet. Translated approximately, it stated, "The reality preserves itself in flame." The instant this phrase was documented, the manuscript was withdrawn from circulation, yet not before a young Ethiopian scholar named Temesgen Johannes sketched the sheet. He had been invited by a sympathetic Jesuit to assist with interpretation, yet after copying the phrase, he was removed from the assignment without explanation. Days afterward, his modest guest chamber near the Tiber was discovered empty, no evidence of conflict, only a torn sheet from his notebook abandoned beneath his pillow. The twist arrived 2 years afterward, during an unrelated examination of medieval texts from northern Ethiopia's hills. A Vatican researcher uncovered an almost identical phrase inscribed in the margin of a completely separate codex. Identical style, identical ink, identical glow. Yet this codex had never departed Ethiopia. The 2 volumes were divided by oceans, by centuries, yet displayed the same hand, or so it appeared. The ink, it seemed, was not simply substance, it was recollection. To this moment, the Vatican will not address the manuscript. It's reportedly sealed in the Archivum Secretum, positioned inside a lead-lined vessel, maintained distant from light, not due to its delicacy, but because of what it opposes. Silence, obscurity, elimination. Brother Anselmo died in 1952. His final words, murmured to the librarian who attended him, were simple. It is not that the ink cannot diminish, it is that the truth. They claim the Ark of the Covenant vanished into history, consumed by conflict, flames, or plunder. Yet in northern Ethiopia's hills, beneath the shade of murmuring fig trees, stands a modest chapel protected by one man. He never departs the grounds. He doesn't address visitors. He doesn't dine with others. His existence is committed to a singular purpose, to protect what his community believes represents the holiest object on earth. The Ark. Not a reproduction, not a representation. The Ark. According to Ethiopian tradition, the Ark reached Aksum nearly 3 millennia past, brought by Menelik, Solomon's son, and the Queen of Sheba's offspring. It wasn't seized. They claim it was entrusted, removed from Jerusalem with heaven's own blessing, transported across wilderness and ranges, concealed in the highlands. Since then, it has been defended by successive generations of monks, observed by a solitary guardian selected for existence. The Vatican has never formally acknowledged the assertion, yet that hasn't prevented its interest. In the early 20th century, a series of Vatican representatives were discreetly dispatched to Ethiopia. Their missions were not announced, nor were their documented findings. One of them, Father Bartolomeo Giusti, composed a message now sealed deep in the Archivum Secretum. In it, he characterizes the external structure of the Aksum Chapel and the ceremonies surrounding it. He never glimpsed the Ark, yet he described sensing something ancient and oppressive, as if the earth itself retained memory of what rested inside. What the Vatican feared wasn't solely the prospect that the Ark was genuine, but that it had never been theirs. Rome had devoted centuries constructing the instruments of authority. Relics were more than sacred. They were mechanisms of dominion, bones of martyrs, fragments of the true cross, thorns from the crown, all meticulously protected in golden vessels. Yet the ark that was distinct, the ark was God's own voice. It had divided waters, it had shattered walls, it had condemned monarchs. If such an object rested not in Rome, but in Africa, the entire framework of ecclesiastical authority would splinter. The twist arrived during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. In 1937, Italian forces, under directives from Mussolini's government, advanced toward the chapel in Axum. They never crossed the threshold. According to testimony recorded years afterward by an Ethiopian priest, the soldiers halted at the chapel's entrance, gazed upward at the sky, and retreated. One of them claimed hearing a sound resembling thunder, though the sky was cloudless. What transpired that day remains unexplained. Yet following that, the Vatican's investigations into the Ark ceased. No additional messages, no additional missions. Today, the chapel remains standing. The Guardian continues watching. No photographs document the interior. No academic has confirmed what resides within. Yet the quietness conveys meaning. For in the Vatican's deepest chambers, where the oldest secrets rest behind secured compartments, there exists a folder without identification, and inside it, they claim, lies only one thing, a map of Axum, folded 12 times and a solitary word inscribed across the summit, returned. In Axum's centre, behind a tall stone barrier and iron entrance, stands a cathedral most will never witness. Inside it is not expansive, not gilded, not filled with travellers or melodies. It is modest, even plain from the exterior, yet it holds a stillness that feels weighted. This is the chapel that holds the tablet, the single most forbidden location in all of Ethiopia. Nobody goes inside, not the priests, not the kings, not the scholars or the presidents. Just one man, the keeper of the Ark, has permission to step across that threshold. He never leaves these grounds. He never talks to reporters. He rests in a tiny stone dwelling next to the chapel and dedicates his entire existence to protecting what lies within. The structure you see today isn't ancient. It was reconstructed during the 20th century right beside the older cathedral of St. Mary of Zion. But what's housed inside is thought to be millennia old. Legend says the Ark of the Covenant rests within those walls, carried to Ethiopia by Menelik, King Solomon's son, and concealed there ever since. The Vatican has never directly rejected this story, yet it's never validated it either. Back in 1978, a Vatican official named Monsignor Paolo Mancini travelled to Axum claiming interfaith dialogue as his purpose. What he really wanted was one look at that sacred artefact. He met with community leaders, toured the churches, brought offerings. But when he requested access to the chapel, the answer was absolute. No. He departed Axum 48 hours later and never mentioned that journey in public again. However, 5 years after that, his private journal surfaced. Following his passing, one entry, carefully penned in Latin, caught everyone's attention. What remains concealed here isn't folklore, it's inheritance, and our timing was off. Back in Rome, whispers started circulating among record keepers and academics, not just about the Ark, but about the reason nobody could enter that chapel. Some were convinced that crossing that threshold without sacred authorization would result in death. Others insisted the Ark emitted some kind of radiance invisible to human vision, yet perceptible in your very bones. One account quietly shared among Ethiopian clergy tells of a young trainee who once tried to glimpse through a gap in the chapel entrance. He never uttered another word for his remaining years. The unexpected turn happened in 2005 when a new keeper was selected. Following custom, the former one died shortly after the succession, as though the weight of guarding the Ark consumed a man's essence entirely. The Vatican dispatched a sympathy letter but attached a proposal for communication. That correspondence received no reply. Whatever exists inside that cathedral stays unverified by any contemporary institution. But maybe that's exactly the purpose. Not every truth is designed for examination. Some need to stay locked away, not because they're fabricated, but because they hold too much force to be handled. Below the golden radiance of St. Peter's Basilica, deep beneath the smooth marble surfaces and resonating choir sections, lies a system of chambers rarely accessed by anyone. These spaces aren't packed with volumes or manuscripts, but with items, hundreds of them: skeletal remains, burial cloths, thorns, fragments of timber, fabric, crystal and rock. Every single one is secured in a container, locked behind bronze gates, marked in Latin and protected in stillness. These are the Vatican's sacred remains, and they serve a purpose beyond commemoration. They represent influence. From Christianity's earliest days, Rome has gathered the holy fragments of saints and witnesses to faith. A finger bone from Thomas, a strand from Mary's head, a piece of the feeding trough where Christ supposedly rested. These remains are thought to carry divine presence, sacred force that still produces wonders. Travellers cross thousands of miles simply to view them, but what most fail to grasp is the intensity with which they're safeguarded, not merely for devotion, but for dominance. A relic isn't just an artifact from history, it's a declaration. It announces, "This belongs to us." And through the Church's perspective, possessing a holy object means possessing a portion of the narrative. This fixation intensified during the Crusades, when warriors swept across the Holy Land. They came back with pieces of execution tools, fabrics marked with ancient stains, and rocks from Golgotha's slopes. Some were authentic, some weren't. But accuracy mattered less than symbolism. Rome transformed into the hub not just of belief, but of ownership. Then came an understated opposition from the east. In Ethiopia's highlands there existed relics untouched by any pope. Documents more ancient than Rome. Sacred images never witnessed by Western observers. And maybe most concerning of all, the Ark of the Covenant. If that Ark were genuine, and if it actually sat in Axum, then Rome's whole collection would rank second. No relic within Vatican walls could match the vessel that once contained God's voice. That anxiety wasn't voiced publicly, but in private chambers gatherings took place, correspondence was sent, representatives were deployed. In one confidential document from 1954, a cardinal expressed his worry that Ethiopia's relics possessed a narrative predating ours. The sentence was underlined 2 times. The revelation arrived when a covert delegation travelled to Ethiopia under Haile Selassie's rule. Their stated purpose was diplomatic relations. Their actual assignment was documenting relics. They came back empty-handed. Yet their expressions revealed something different. One member left the priesthood shortly afterward. Now Rome's storage remains filled, but something has shifted. Word has it that among the most ancient containers hidden on the bottom shelf of the most protected room sits an empty receptacle. No marking, no identification, just an inscription carved in Latin, so aged the characters are starting to disappear, acquired before our arrival, never given back. Spring of 1947 saw an obscure Vatican personality boarding a vessel from Naples using an assumed identity. He displayed no papal insignia, no Swiss guard accompanied him, no journalists followed his route. This individual was Albino Luciani, a future pope, though nobody would have predicted it at that moment. His assignment was discreet, unannounced, and unrecorded. An informal trip to Africa that would vanish from church documentation for over 3 decades. The expedition took him through Eritrea, then into Ethiopia's highlands. He journeyed by rail, then on foot, speaking sparingly, constantly writing in a leather journal he kept pressed against his body. Upon reaching Axum, he stopped, not as a spiritual authority, but as a humble visitor in wonder. The legends had arrived in Rome well before him. Stories of the Ark, concealed monasteries, holy texts untouched by Latin influence. Yet nothing had equipped him for his discovery. Within a stone-enclosed church near the ancient palace remains. He was presented with a collection of illustrated manuscripts. The priest guiding him spoke flawless Italian, but provided no clarifications. Just sheet after sheet of ancient Gayes writing filled with depictions of celestial beings, descendants and dark-robed individuals kneeling in flames. Luciani recorded in his journal, "The devotion here predates recollection and carries double the quietness." One night, he was asked to join an elderly monk who had dedicated himself to the church for more than 70 years. They conversed by firelight, and although Luciani couldn't comprehend the monk's language, he sensed something transmitted between them. A recognition not of vocabulary, but of deep respect. He came back to Rome 14 days later, discreetly, with no official statement. Yet his personal records reveal something else. Tucked in the rear of his journal sits a solitary sentence, written in Latin and circled 3 occasions. They never required our presence, and that represents the real threat. When Luciani ascended to Pope John Paul I in 1978, he lasted merely 33 days before his unexpected passing. No post-mortem examination was conducted. The stated reason was cardiac arrest. Still, speculation has persisted ever since. Some claim he had planned to disclose certain files connected to the Ethiopian church. Others think he had started composing a fresh strategy for interfaith relations, one that recognised Ethiopia not as Rome's younger extension, but as its equal. The mystery resides in the censored archive titled East Missions 47. The folder holds ripped sheets, absent correspondence, and one picture with scorched borders, where a young Luciani stands outside the chapel of the tablet, gazing not at the structure, but at the heavens. What he witnessed there, nobody can determine. Yet deep within Vatican archives, an aging clerk once stated he detected Luciani's voice in a recording. The tape was nearly soundless, aside from 6 quiet words. Certain relics aren't meant to come back. During the late 1930s, beneath war and empire's darkness, the Vatican issued a subtle appeal. It wasn't documented in any formal correspondence. It didn't travel through diplomatic channels. Rather, it moved through murmurs from Rome to Addis Ababa, transported by individuals who didn't wear religious garments, but military dress. Their objective was straightforward in language, unachievable in essence: transport the Ark to Rome. The scheme had developed years before, throughout Mussolini's Ethiopian offensive. As Italian troops flooded through the nation, capturing settlements and valuables, particular personalities within the Vatican recognised a chance. If the Ark of the Covenant actually existed, if it wasn't merely mythology, but a physical object, it needed to be transported to Christianity's centre. Not for research, they declared, but for safekeeping in confidential discussions. Others employed a different term: acquisition. The concept wasn't to take it through darkness, but to transfer it beneath the guise of rescue. One paper now concealed in Vatican archives bore the title Operation Exodus. It described a strategy to extract the Ark, disguised as religious ritual, asserting it had been provided voluntarily. The Ethiopian church would be informed it was temporary, an act of solidarity, a holy trade between faithful siblings. Yet the monks in Axum didn't trust exchanges. And they didn't overlook the previous instance Rome had claimed something under Unity's banner. When Italian troops neared the chapel of the tablet in 1937, the Guardian positioned himself alone at the entrance, carrying only a wooden cross. He spoke nothing. He remained motionless. The troops, bewildered, contacted headquarters for instructions. They received orders to hold position. Yet by evening, circumstances transformed. One soldier years afterward admitted in an unsent correspondence. He documented that as twilight descended, the chapel started radiating, not with flames, but with a faint luminescence that appeared to shift like respiration. Birds ceased their songs. The atmosphere grew dense, and from behind the chapel barriers emerged what he characterized as a noise without noise, a quietness so profound it ached. They abandoned the entrance undisturbed. Rome never recognized the operation. The designation Operation Exodus was eliminated from every formal record. Still, in 1962, throughout the Second Vatican Council, an Ethiopian bishop received an unusually extended private meeting with the Pope. No record was created, no overview documented, yet following this, the Pope reportedly cancelled a scheduled pilgrimage to Jerusalem. As an alternative, he requested to traverse the archive halls unaccompanied. The Ark never reached Rome. It stays in Axum, undisturbed, invisible, unclaimed. However, the effort left an impression, a recollection buried in the quietness between two religious institutions. Some suggest that setback transformed the Vatican, that it reminded Rome's highest authorities that not all sacred things belong to their possession. Certain enigmas aren't intended for grasping, and the most valuable treasures are those that resist capture. There exists a chamber below the Vatican Library where time appears frozen. The illumination is subdued, streaming through heavy glass sections embedded in the ceiling. The barriers are covered with shelving, some vacant, some containing weathered containers bound closed with cord. And in one section, beyond a steel barrier with no official access key, lies a volume that nobody is meant to know about. It's absent from any inventory, not even the classified ones. Record keepers refer to it as the Red Book, despite being bound not in vibrant scarlet, but in a profound, almost ebony shade of hide. The backbone is deteriorated. The sheets are dense. The script is handwritten in Ge'ez, a writing system the typical Vatican expert cannot interpret. There's no heading, no writer. Just a lone symbol burned onto the front covering, a winged being with three countenances staring in separate directions. The initial time this volume reached Rome, it generated bewilderment. The year was 1929. It arrived within a delivery of texts salvaged from a monastery during territorial turmoil in Ethiopia. Most were directed to interpretation chambers, but this particular one was isolated almost instantly. A youthful Jesuit researcher opened it and lost consciousness before completing the second sheet. He never clarified the reason. The volume was transferred to a restricted storage marked as awaiting interpretation. It was never handled again, at minimum not formally. Still across the decades, rumours started spreading among the Vatican's most reliable copyists. They discussed the volume that wouldn't deteriorate. One record keeper insisted he observed a sheet flip on its own. Another, after remaining alone in the chamber excessively long, abandoned the church without justification and withdrew to his mountain village in the Alps. He never entered a library afterward. During the 1950s, a scholar tried to catalogue the volume. He assigned it a temporary identifier and commenced completing the registration document. Yet each time he inscribed its designation, the fluid vanished. He attempted once more with another writing instrument, then a graphite stick, then calcium carbonate. The sheet remained clear. The document was submitted regardless, vacant but sealed, preserved in the archive's rear. That closure was subsequently discovered fractured. Although the registry chamber stayed perpetually secured, nobody ever confessed to accessing it. Recently, speculation emerged that the volume holds an alternative rendition of the Book of Enoch, one that merges the narrative of the Watchers with predictions absent from any recognised scripture. Some think it discusses three concealed arks positioned in separate territories, each containing a portion of celestial flame. Others claim it identifies popes, monarchs, and saints with birth dates, death dates, and something more peculiar. Reappearance now. If you question any Vatican representative about the volume, they'll inform you it's non-existent. Yet occasionally, during the motionless midnight hours, the sentry on shift swears he detects sheets turning in the blackness, even with nobody present. It was discovered within a fabric container concealed behind the compartment of a Vatican archivist's workspace, one that hadn't been accessed since his passing in 1968. This individual, Brother Matteo Ferrani, was reserved, thorough, and recognised for arranging the most delicate documents with precision. He seldom conversed during dining. He dedicated extended periods in the archive's deepest section. And then one sunrise, he failed to report for duties. His cardiac function had ceased during slumber, or that's what they claimed. The key was uncovered by his replacement. It was diminutive, frigid upon contact, constructed from a shadowy metal that didn't correspond to anything else in the archive. The ridges were unusual, too refined, too numerous. Not a single archivist could identify the mechanism it operated. It possessed no identifier, no designation. It matched no recognised entrance. Nevertheless, the Vatican preserved it. A dossier was initiated, as all peculiar discoveries are. Yet it became sparse rapidly. No designer identified the key's construction. No locksmith could duplicate it. It was positioned in a sealed package and relocated to a compartment labelled undesignated. Across time, it evolved into somewhat of a subtle jest among scribes. The key to absence, the key to the realm, the key to an entrance the Church misplaced. However, then during spring 1983, something peculiar occurred. A visiting Ethiopian academic, invited to examine the Ge'ez scrolls, was shown the key throughout a visit. He didn't chuckle. Rather, he became ashen. He requested to be seated, and following an extended pause, he shared something that silenced the entire chamber. He had encountered an entrance resembling it previously, not in Rome, but in a monastery concealed near the Eritrean frontier. He stated the key was formed like the archaic sun cross utilised in pre-Christian sanctuaries, and in the monastery he toured as a youth, there existed a stone portal closed for ages, with no grip, just a slim opening in the configuration of that identical symbol. When he attempted to elaborate further, the visit was concluded. That evening, his accommodation was discovered vacant. He abandoned his belongings and travel documents. No account was registered, no evidence ever located. Across the subsequent years, the key has been relocated twice. Initially to a restricted cabinet in the papal residences, once more to a wall strongbox inside the archives, behind a depiction of a deceased pope whose identity is no longer mentioned. Some think it's merely a peculiarity. Others think it accesses something not constructed by mortal hands. A few murmurs propose that somewhere below the Vatican, deeper than the burial passages, further than the sepulchres, exists a closed chamber with no documentation, no brightness, and no oxygen. An entrance with no designation awaiting one key, and a secret the Church wasn't supposed to access. During winter 1937, Pope Pius XIV sat isolated in his workspace, encompassed by unopened mail and African charts. Beyond, Rome was agitated. Italy's military had advanced far into Ethiopia, and the Holy See had obtained intelligence not merely of conflict, but of relics, volumes, and churches no Western observer had witnessed. Among the papers positioned on the Pope's workspace that evening was one dossier secured in twine, labelled Critical Eyes Exclusively. It originated from a Jesuit liaison positioned near Lake Tana. Within were drawings, diary passages, and a converted excerpt from a manuscript discovered deep in Ethiopia's highland hills. The text written in Ge'ez described a prediction concerning a missing gospel, a dark lion, and a rock city concealed underground. One phrase was highlighted in crimson fluid. When Rome contacts what it cannot comprehend, the blaze will emerge. Pope Pius V examined the phrase 3 occasions. Then he demanded the entrance be secured. He was an individual of strict regulation, an academic at core, and although he trusted in understanding, he likewise dreaded what it might destroy. The Vatican had accumulated secrets for ages, some too hazardous to vocalize. This wasn't myth. This wasn't whispered folklore passed through generations. This discovery threatened to rewrite the foundations of Christian history. What shook him wasn't the revelation itself, but where it came from. The ancient scroll had been verified beyond doubt. The ink composition matched techniques from before Christ's era. The parchment showed deterioration patterns typical of documents spanning 2 millennia, and the translation cross, examined by 3 independent experts, left no room for interpretation. It described not a Messiah descended from David's lineage, but born from Solomon's union with Sheba's queen. It positioned the ark not in Jerusalem's heart, but in Axum's sacred grounds. It revealed a church founded not upon Peter's remains, but on a covenant forged in Africa's highlands. That very evening, the Pope issued a spoken command to his inner circle. Seal the Ethiopian records. Transfer the scroll to secure storage. Block all investigation into Ethiopian texts, visions, and sacred objects unless authorized directly by the Holy Office. By morning, a directive circulated through the Vatican archives. A fresh classification protocol emerged. The Ethiopian materials received special security, assigned a new designation, Index Sanctus Obscura, the registry of concealed sacred matters. Decades afterward, when Pope Pius V passed under mysterious conditions in 1939, his private records underwent review. Yet the Ethiopian dossier had disappeared. Only his handwritten message survived, pressed between his Bible's pages. What we suppress now may explode into chaos later. Yet may the Church escape that judgment. No pontiff has ever lifted his prohibition, and the documents stay locked. She answered only to Ababa, a word signifying flower in ancient Ethiopian language. A medicine woman, a prophet, and someone believed to commune with celestial beings. Her existence unfolded in the verdant slopes surrounding Lake Tana through the late 18th century. Native clergy deemed her sanctified. Townspeople swore she brought corpses back to breath, and temporarily even Rome contemplated her canonization. Her account initially arrived in the Vatican via a Jesuit correspondence dated 1821. Transported by messenger through wilderness and ocean, the letter detailed Ababa's revelations, her miraculous healings, and her capacity to quote complete biblical sections, including passages absent from any Rome-sanctioned scripture. She spoke in Ge'ez, but when written down, her utterances reflected pieces from primitive Christian writings vanished since the 2nd century. That factor alone captured the Church's focus. A Vatican representative, Father Lorenzo de Monti, received orders to examine the claims. He entered Ethiopia disguised as a pilgrim, joined by a translator and a recorder. His discovery wasn't deception or blasphemy, but a serene woman dwelling in a stone chamber encircled by flickering lights, ancient manuscripts and quietude. She claimed no authority, possessed no rank, yet neighbours travelled vast distances simply to kneel at her presence. Father Lorenzo documented his encounter in a leather journal now buried within Vatican vaults. There, he characterized her as demonstrating a spiritual luminosity unparalleled by any sister or visionary I have witnessed. He personally observed what he termed a restoration beyond comprehension. When Ababa placed her palms upon a perishing infant, the child's eyes opened instantly and spoke. The burning has departed. What alarmed the Vatican, though, wasn't her sanctity. It was her understanding. Ababa discussed freely her visions concerning Christianity's origins. She identified disciples whose identities had been erased from official records. She insisted the first sacrificial table erected following Christ's crucifixion stood not in Rome, but in Axum, and she mentioned a dark volume entombed beneath a collapsed monastery, bound with precious metal, protected by a mission. The Vatican's uncertainty deepened. In 1824, the Congregation for the Causes of Saints initiated her proceedings, yet completion never came. Papers vanished, a witness recanted, and Father Lorenzo, after returning to the Vatican, became unexpectedly sick. He perished before his closing testimony could be presented. Just one page remained. Found years later, concealed in his travel bag's interior. Upon it, a personal notation stated, "She approached too near the reality. Unsuitable for our era. Premature." Ababa's identity was struck from canonization files. Yet in Ethiopia's mountains her legacy endures. Her burial site continues drawing seekers of restoration. Her chamber stands preserved. And annually, on her death's commemoration, a modest stone sanctuary's bells sound. Without human touch upon the cord, the Vatican speaks her name no longer. Yet in history's shadowed recesses, she remains the saint who almost ascended. His identity was Brother Matthias, an unassuming figure with an unassuming role. Through more than 3 decades, he laboured within the Vatican's Archivum Secretum, the papal private library, where admission was severely limited and understanding of its true depths even rarer. His responsibility appeared straightforward: preserve organisation of restricted collections, regulate environmental conditions for ancient documents, and catalogue any recently prohibited texts. He never challenged the classifications, and none challenged him. Yet in his service's closing years, Brother Matthias started describing visions during sleep. Initially, he confided only in the overnight security. Then the maintenance worker dreams of nameless peaks, azure, burning celestial bodies, and speech in an unfamiliar tongue he nonetheless comprehended. He awakened with syllables on his lips resembling tempest and gale, and repeatedly the identical revelation resonated through his consciousness. The blaze exists within the earth. One dawn in 1978's winter, Matthias appeared tardy. His gaze appeared bloodshot, his limbs trembled. He informed the chief archivist of requiring entry to Vault C, among the most ancient and safeguarded chambers beneath Vatican territory. That petition alone sparked concern. Vault C contained materials linked to primitive Christian movements considered threatening, heretical, or simply too peculiar for inclusion in the Church's narrative. Within that chamber rested a crimson leather codex, long abandoned, its sheets too delicate for reproduction. Its source traced to a monastery in Ethiopia's north. It bore no heading, no creator, merely symbols inscribed in both Ge'ez and an earlier language one Vatican linguists never completely decoded. The volume had remained undisturbed for almost a century until that moment when Brother Matthias accessed it without authorization. Subsequently, he would assert he felt compelled toward it. He informed the overseeing cardinal that his dream's voice had guided him to text concealed within the lines. "Beyond mere ink," he murmured, "but illumination. There exists communication in the page's scorching." The cardinal rejected him. The volume was resealed. Matthias was dismissed from his position and discreetly pensioned. Yet 3 weeks onward, another episode unfolded. Guards discovered him prostrate in St. Peter's Square's middle. Unshod, his garments shredded, he vocalized in Ge'ez, though none understood his acquisition of it. He echoed the same statement repeatedly: "The volume is not vanished. The earth retains memory." He disappeared the following morning. No evidence, no correspondence, not even goodbye to his brother monks. The Vatican released no declaration. His identity was silently erased from the official Vatican personnel registry. Yet, in Vault C's logbook, still preserved in ink on parchment, his mark persists. One entry, dated and inscribed in an unsteady script: "Matthias for the illumination beneath the rock." None has accessed the volume afterward. In the remote corners of a stone sanctuary nestled deep within Ethiopia's highlands, a supplication is uttered not toward a remote deity, but toward one who traversed the planet with unshod souls and heated respiration. For the Ethiopian Church, Christ exists not solely as celestial, but as living tissue, enigma contained in epidermis, not symbolism. This concept, though primordial, generated tremors throughout Vatican corridors long before Rome's formal assemblies determined what could and couldn't be proclaimed regarding Christ's essence. The Ethiopian believers maintained their distinct perspective. They accepted that God had not simply assumed appearance, but had transformed into appearance, not representation, not disguise, but humanity in completeness, bone, circulation, and essence unified. It was conviction transmitted not through dogma, but through melody, through narrative, through frankincense fragrance, ascending through hewn stone corridors. For the Western institution, this perspective troubled them. Through the 4th and 5th centuries, theological disputes erupted into flames. Assemblies convened, arguments intensified. The Council of Chalcedon in year 451 pronounced a rigid position Christ embodied both complete divinity and complete humanity, dual natures without blending. Yet the Ethiopian Church abstained from that assembly. They clung to their perpetual belief that Christ's celestial and mortal essence were singular, inseparable, not merely united, but indistinct. Rome labelled it deviation. Vatican theologians documented assessments. They classified Ethiopian theology as monophysite, terminology employed to identify and segregate, yet those intimate with Ethiopian monasteries recognized differently. Their discovery wasn't deviation, but enigma too profound for neat categorizations. One such theologian, Father Emilianus, toured the monastery of Debre Damo in year 1927. He departed with a sculpted representation of Christ, unlike any he'd previously encountered. The gaze was tender yet dark, the complexion warm and earthen, the garments unfamiliar in design. He appeared not Roman, Emilianus recorded in his diary, but like humanity of the territory. And yet I couldn't avert my eyes. What most disturbed the Vatican wasn't the representation, but the authority supporting it. These weren't false images. They were living doctrine born not of assemblies, but of connection, transferred from elder to offspring, from clergy to youth, through accounts too ancient to follow. A Vatican administrator, after examining Emilianus' findings, drafted a confidential memo. Their Christ differs from ours. He doesn't submit to Rome. That phrase was never intended for visibility beyond the archives, yet a duplicate survived, inserted into a neglected report's rear. It rests now in a compartment, aged yellow, its significance still piercing. For within Ethiopia's devotion exists an inquiry the Vatican never completely resolved. What if Christ's enigma wasn't in comprehending him, but in abandoning attempts to define him entirely? In northern Ethiopia's golden slopes, long before amplification and marble sanctuaries, there existed a murmur that evolved into conviction, and that conviction into narrative. It was the narrative of a Christ who wasn't dual, but triple. Not merely mortal and celestial, as Rome's church had meticulously proclaimed, but something more ancient and more enigmatic. Celestial, mortal, and ethereal, interwoven together in fashion that couldn't be separated. For the Ethiopian monks, this concept wasn't novel. It permeated their hymns, shaped their crosses, concealed between their ancient gayes. It wasn't insurrection, it was veneration, an enigma too expansive for Rome's classifications. Yet in the Vatican this subdued conviction triggered apprehension. Throughout the Council of Chalcedon in year 451, Rome's church had secured the doctrine permanently. Christ possessed dual natures, not singular, not triple. It was established as law. To assert otherwise meant deviation. And yet Ethiopia missed that assembly. They preserved their tradition intact, their individual sacred writings unaltered, and within those writings existed the concept that Christ contained a third dimension, not merely celestial and mortal, but a Holy Spirit that travelled between beyond and inside. A young Jesuit theologian named Aurelius de Santi was among the initial to document this conviction following a covert expedition to Ethiopia in year 1924. His observations, never released but archived in the Vatican's restricted records, mention a dialogue with a monk at Lake Tana's boundary. The monk had met his gaze and stated, "To understand Christ, you must encounter him not as dual halves, but as complete enigma." That phrase tormented de Santi. In his private diary he admitted bewilderment, even dread. "Their belief is not fractured," he inscribed. "It exceeds ours in depth, yet it diverges from ours." De Santi's account activated a subdued warning in the Vatican. The concept of a third dimension, an ethereal dimension, didn't correspond with Western doctrine. It implied something animate, respiring, transforming, something unregulated. The Vatican feared what this might ignite. Shortly thereafter, a memorandum circulated among senior cardinals. It cautioned of expanding curiosity in Ethiopian writings and advocated limitations on all investigation into the alleged three natures deviation. The designation persisted, though no Ethiopian clergy had employed it. Yet truthfully, the concept was never regarding deviation. It was regarding awe, an alternative method of perceiving Christ, not through boundaries and legislation, but through enigma, melody, and stillness. And though the Vatican secured those records away, the narrative still exists in sculpted sanctuaries, in murmured supplications, and in manuscripts concealed where sunlight penetrates only annually. And thus the inquiry persists, gentle yet unwavering. What if the reality the Vatican dreaded was never incorrect, merely unfamiliar? In a modest sanctuary, positioned behind the Ethiopian college's elevated stone barriers in Rome, there formerly displayed a canvas that none discussed. It wasn't featured in any travel literature. Visitors never viewed the chamber. Even most clergy passed it unknowingly. Yet those who witnessed it never dismissed it. The representation was remarkable not for its dimensions, but for its quietude. It displayed Christ positioned on a sculpted timber throne, his soles resting on a cloud cushion. Surrounding him, golden radiance flickered through delicate brushwork. Yet it wasn't the throne or the gold or even the clouds that generated discomfort. It was his countenance. Christ was rendered as a black individual, his complexion a rich brown, his gaze broad and tranquil, his hair densely coiled, his bearing neither hostile nor gentle, but motionless as if anticipating. The Creator had captured something primordial, something both majestic and mortal. The canvas was believed created in the early 1600s, transported from Aksum to Rome by an Ethiopian clergy named Father Tekle Hymenot. He transported it in a timber container wrapped in fabric and devotion. Initially, it was positioned with dignity inside the modest sanctuary. Yet decades onward, following a papal leadership transition, it was silently eliminated. No justification was ever offered. The Vatican never denounced the representation explicitly. There were no formal declarations, no public directives. Yet behind private doors, speculation circulated. Some murmured that the canvas challenged excessively, that it addressed inquiries the institution wasn't prepared to confront. Because if Christ had been witnessed and venerated as black by complete Christian nations for centuries, what did that signify for the narrative Western Europe had constructed? What did it signify for the representations lining St. Peter's Basilica's corridors? For the pale marble sculptures? For the chronicle that had moulded empires and rationalised authority? It is stated that in year 1942, throughout war's chaos, the canvas was eliminated altogether. A Vatican librarian subsequently inscribed in a diary entry marked confidential that it had been relocated to storage beneath the Archivum Secretum, not demolished, merely concealed. Yet not all narratives remain concealed. In the early 2000s, a photograph emerged, just one of the canvas. A theologian claimed it had been captured in the 1970s by a visiting Ethiopian monk. The Vatican never validated its legitimacy, yet those who had witnessed the original stated the photograph was genuine, the identical countenance, the identical gaze. And thus the enigma persists. Was the vision of Christ as a black individual too divergent, or merely too accurate? Perhaps the greater apprehension wasn't the representation itself, but the quietude that ensued, the inquiries it posed without utterance, and the chronicle it contained in plain sight. In a metropolis constructed on sacred convention, sometimes the most powerful realities are the ones concealed not in obscurity, but in daylight, behind a secured entrance. The blaze was modest, yet the documents combusted rapidly. It occurred late evening in the garden behind the apostolic palace. A servant grasping the flame was instructed to avert his gaze. A cardinal observed in quietude, and the individual who issued the directive? He remained with his palms folded, his countenance ashen in the lunar illumination. He was the Pope. Not every mystery in the Vatican is interred beneath rock. Some are transformed to cinders. The record in question wasn't lengthy, under 50 sheets, secured in coarse leather, the writing inscribed in a meticulous script. Yet what it stated, what it ventured to state, rendered it threatening. It discussed visions, of prediction, and of a doctrine that didn't correspond with what Rome had proclaimed sacred. It described a Christ not merely witnessed in mortal appearance, but one who travelled among the impoverished in Ethiopia, who communicated in the primordial language of Ge'ez, and who designated as sanctified those never recognised to the Western sphere. The Pope, who commanded its elimination, wasn't known for fury. He was a reserved individual, contemplative, private. Yet something in the writing must have disturbed him. Some suggest it was a section that alleged the Church had selected the incorrect direction a millennium prior. Others accept it was an identity, a long-abandoned Ethiopian monk whose doctrines paralleled those of the primitive apostles more intimately than anything in the Roman canon. Whatever it was, it violated a boundary. Not the boundary of deviation alone, but something more profound, something more ancient, a challenge to control's very foundation. The blaze devoured the volume in under 10 minutes, yet not entirely. Unknown to the Pope, one of the Vatican archivists had produced a duplicate, handwritten sheet by sheet. He had not accomplished it from insurrection, but from reverence. He accepted the utterances were sacred. He accepted they shouldn't be dismissed. He concealed the duplicate in a manuscript container, securing it behind a concealed section in a modest sanctuary outside the metropolis. That sanctuary is no longer utilised. It was shut in the 1950s following a lightning impact damaged the covering. Yet the section, it is stated, persists. What terrified the Pope wasn't blaze or even the apprehension of revelation. It was what the volume made achievable, an alternative narrative, an alternative Christ, an institution not centred in Rome but in Africa's highlands, where rock sanctuaries contained voices that didn't mirror the Vatican's doctrines. In the Vatican, quietude can be more resonant than chimes, and when something is combusted, it isn't always erased. Sometimes blaze is only the narrative's beginning. It was modest, not exceeding a serving dish, enclosed in dark timber and wrapped in fabric. It arrived at the Vatican silently, like many relics accomplish. There was no procession, no proclamation. Only a solitary monk from Ethiopia's highlands who travelled the final distance unshod, transporting the canvas as though it were animate. He communicated minimal Latin, merely sufficient to state, "This belongs to both of us presently." The canvas displayed the Madonna and infant, yet not in the typical European manner. The complexion was dark, the gaze profound and almond-configured, and the garments abundant in pigment, gold, scarlet, and azure. The Christ infant grasped a manuscript, not a crucifix, and in the distance were indistinct slopes that resembled nothing like Bethlehem. They resembled northern Ethiopia's peaks. It was suspended in a lateral sanctuary near the basilica's rear. Limited noticed it initially. There were no markers, no inscriptions, just a canvas positioned between illuminations, left to be discovered by roaming pilgrims and silent clergy. Yet within a month, murmurs commenced. A custodian was the initial to document it. He alleged the gaze moved, not abruptly, not in a spectral fashion, but gradually, as if they pursued those who approached too intimately. Then arrived the clergy, who discovered droplets on the surface beneath it, modest, transparent and viscous, like tears. He eliminated them. Yet the following morning they reappeared. A collection of theologians was summoned. They inspected the enclosure, the pigments, the exterior. Nothing peculiar, no deception, no substances. The fabric behind the canvas was pristine and arid, yet the moisture continued returning. One afternoon, throughout a subdued mass, a sister positioned in the second bench gasped. The canvas, she stated, had wept directly before her gaze. She witnessed it, not fantasized, not dreamed. The tears descended down the Madonna's features and dissolved before they contacted the enclosure. That evening, the canvas was removed, not demolished, not returned. It was concealed. No formal declaration was issued, no reference in the archives. Yet a guard assigned to the papal residence that evening detected a heated dialogue behind a secured entrance. The Pope wasn't hostile. He was terrified. If word escapes, he stated, we will forfeit the centre. The canvas was believed to originate from a monastery established in the 5th century. It had suspended over an altar where pilgrims supplicated in gay airs, the primordial language the Vatican could never completely regulate. And the manuscript in the infant's grasp, according to the monk, wasn't from Luke's Gospel or Matthew. It was from Enoch's book, a volume that Rome had secured away. The Vatican preserves many things behind secured entrances, yet this canvas, modest and subdued, left a resonance that has never diminished. Some suggest it still weeps even presently, behind rock, in the quietude where belief and apprehension converge. In spring 1935, dark masses gathered over Africa, and Rome observed in quietude. At that quietude's core remained two powerful individuals. One wore a white garment and communicated only in public benedictions. The other wore a black uniform, proclaimed from platforms, and vowed to restore an empire. Pope Pius V and Benito Mussolini never remained side by side. Yet they shared beyond geography. They shared mysteries. When Mussolini prepared to assault Ethiopia, the Vatican didn't elevate its voice. There were no public denunciations, no sermons of tranquility. Instead, there were confidential gatherings, undocumented visits between representatives and clergy, gatherings conducted behind the apostolic palace's substantial entrances. The assault commenced in October 1935. Aircraft released toxic vapour. Sanctuaries were devastated, monasteries incinerated, and yet St. Peter's Square remained subdued. It wasn't because the Vatican sanctioned the violence, no. Yet Ethiopia's interpretation of Christianity, its primordial volumes, its extensive memory, its assertion to the Ark of the Covenant, was perceived as a threatening parallel, one too intimate to Rome, one that had endured without it. One record subsequently revealed in the margins of a diplomatic document suggests a disturbing rationale. A handwritten notation beside a typed assessment from a papal consultant states, "If the libraries incinerate, we will never have to respond for what we didn't instruct." That solitary phrase communicates abundantly. For hundreds of years, the Vatican had guided the course of history through holy scriptures. But in Ethiopia, those same scriptures revealed something entirely different. The Queen of Sheba had journeyed to Jerusalem. Her son Menelik carried away the ark. The Ethiopian Bible contained books that Rome had cast aside, and throughout everything their clergy spoke in Ge'ez, a tongue more ancient than Latin, untouched by European councils. Mussolini sought an empire. The Vatican sought dominance over the story being told. Their ambitions intersected, but not everyone was in agreement. A young bishop posted in Florence started composing letters. In those letters he challenged the silence emanating from Rome. He cited the book of Isaiah and spoke of coming judgment. His last letter, written in March of 1937, came back unopened. Soon afterward, he was transferred to a remote village and never wrote for publication again. Decades later, a Jesuit librarian discovered a sealed envelope hidden behind a folder in the Vatican archives. Inside was a photograph. It depicted Ethiopian monks standing amid the wreckage of a church, clutching pieces of an ancient manuscript. Scrawled across the top, in fading ink, were the words, "They tried to erase us." The Vatican never refuted its silence, but it never offered an explanation either. That silence remains. In the gardens beyond St. Peter's Basilica, there stands a small plaque, weathered and easily missed. It carries no name, only a date, October 3rd, 1935, and a single verse of scripture, "Woe unto them that call evil good," a verse selected not for the world, but perhaps for the Church itself. In the dim light of the Vatican's archive section, far from the resonant halls of St. Peter's Basilica, there exists a drawer with no official record. Its label is empty, its key is possessed by no one currently alive. And inside, according to whispered stories from former clerks, lie the Haile Selassie documents. Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia was more than a political figure. He was regarded by his subjects as a sacred king, the 225th direct heir of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. To the Vatican, he symbolized something far more threatening, a sovereign leader who maintained a Christian heritage older than Rome's own. When the Italian occupation of Ethiopia concluded in 1936, Selassie was driven into exile. But during those years away, he spoke with greater force than ever before. In Geneva, standing before the League of Nations, he remained in regal stillness and then gave a speech that echoed through the Vatican's passages. He spoke of judgment. He spoke of justice. He called upon God, not the God of Latin ceremonies, but the ancient God of Ethiopia. It was more than politics. It was prophecy. One priest tasked with diplomatic monitoring at the time, Father Leone Marini, maintained detailed notes of the address. His account, stamped confidential and delivered straight to the Secretariat of State, included an unusual observation. This man does not plead for assistance. He speaks as though he already knows the outcome. After Mussolini's fall and Selassie's restoration to his throne, Rome grew anxious. Vatican representatives were dispatched under diplomatic pretense. Some were instructed to propose reconciliation. Others were directed simply to observe and to monitor. What they discovered caught them off guard. Ethiopian scholars were safeguarding prophecies never rendered into Latin. One document mentioned in a missing Jesuit correspondence suggested that a time would arrive when the Empire of the West would adopt the garments of the East and lose sight of its origins. That correspondence was never made public, but it was documented, then locked away. The most unsettling development came in 1949, when Haile Selassie presented a gift to the Pope, a bound manuscript in Ge'ez and transcribed by desert monks, rumoured to contain visions witnessed by the Emperor himself. It was never exhibited. It was never mentioned. But an internal Vatican memorandum from that year references a book of signs delivered from Ethiopia, now secured in the Archivum Secretum. Due to the character of its contents and the ambiguity of its source, years went by and the documents remained sealed. In 1975, shortly after Selassie's mysterious death while under house confinement, a notation was appended to the file. It was inscribed in red pencil, the same kind used by senior Vatican librarians. "Do not destroy, do not discuss, await the end of the century." No one knows who inscribed that line, and perhaps more disturbingly, no one has attempted to remove it. In the spring of 1936, inside the hushed chambers of the Vatican, an unusual silence descended like dust upon the marble floors of St. Peter's Basilica. It was not the stillness of reverence or devotion, but the kind of silence that comes after a storm one did not anticipate. That storm originated not from Rome, but from Geneva, where a man clothed in ceremonial Ethiopian garments stood isolated before the League of Nations. Emperor Haile Selassie, banished from his country by Mussolini's invasion, stood resolute before the world's representatives. But his words were not simply for them. They were, according to one Vatican diplomat present, directed squarely at Rome. Not merely the government, but the Holy See itself. Selassie's voice, composed and steady, carried with it a warning that went beyond politics. He spoke of justice, of faith, and of the ancient bond between his people and their God. He did not beg, he did not negotiate. Instead, he proclaimed that Ethiopia had preserved the faith of Solomon while the West had abandoned it. He reminded everyone present that Ethiopia had accepted Christianity before Rome ever claimed the cross. The Vatican had dispatched Bishop Armand del Vecchio to witness. He was a reserved man, recognised more for his interpretations of ancient Syriac manuscripts than for diplomacy. But what he observed that day would disturb him. In his private account he wrote, "It was not a speech, it was scripture." And truly, it felt as though the words had been transported from some older, holier era. That night, the resonance of the emperor's voice reached the marble halls of St. Peter's Basilica, though he had never entered inside. Monsignors murmured about the speech, cardinals debated it behind locked doors. The Pope's councillors worried it would inspire a reassessment of Ethiopia's Christian assertions, especially as Rome's own partnerships with fascist Italy became increasingly difficult to justify. What disturbed them most was not simply the substance of the speech, but a phrase that had been omitted from the official record, a phrase spoken softly, almost as though intended for ears beyond the chamber. According to Bishop Del Vecchio, the emperor had concluded by stating, "The Lion of Judah still watches from the mountains, and his roar is not forgotten." That expression, an ancient allusion to both the Solomonic lineage and biblical prophecy, triggered alarm among some Vatican historians. One noted in the margins of the document, "If true, we must reconsider what we call apostolic." The Pope, upon reviewing the account, issued no public declaration. But 3 days afterward, access to the Ethiopian section of the Vatican Library was limited without justification, and Bishop Del Vecchio was relocated to a remote post in northern Spain where he would never write for publication again. The speech, while overlooked by many in the world, was never truly overlooked within the Vatican. Its reverberations still move quietly through the passageways, carried not by wind but by memory, and by fear of a truth that Rome cannot govern. Late one evening in the summer of 1936, the lamps dimmed low in the tunnels beneath Vatican City. The cobbled floor under St. Peter's Square had witnessed many secrets traverse its length. Bishops with prohibited books, librarians transporting locked containers, and cardinals with thoughts they could never voice aloud. But that night the stillness was interrupted by the boots of the Swiss Guard resounding like a warning down the ancient stone passage. It was just after the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, had given his forceful speech in Geneva. Whispers of his words had arrived at the Holy See like smoke threading through gaps in a door. Some claimed his speech had disturbed more than the Pope. Some claimed it had stirred something in the archives below. A guard named Matthias Ulrich, just 22 years old, was positioned at the eastern gateway to the Archivum Secretum. He was inexperienced, enthusiastic, inquisitive. And that night, according to an account buried in the guard records, he witnessed a man in black robes trying to access the restricted chambers. The man possessed no credentials and did not utter a word. But he clutched something in his hand, a small gold-trimmed volume wrapped in red fabric. The guard commanded him to stop. The man did not comply. Ulrich lifted his halberd, and then the man disappeared. Not turned and escaped, not slipped into a side passage. He disappeared as though the shadows themselves had absorbed him. The young guard triggered the alarm. Within moments, 4 others responded. A search was initiated. Every passage beneath the apostolic palace was examined, every entrance verified, but no man was located. Only a single object remained, left on the ground where Ulrich had last observed the figure. A ring, brass, engraved with a single word in Ge'ez script. No one could decipher it. What came next was silence. The incident was never officially recorded in Vatican history. But weeks afterward, two things occurred. First, Ulrich was dismissed from his position, transferred without explanation to a distant basilica in the hills beyond Milan. Second, a collection of unmarked crates arrived from the Ethiopian college and were transported without documentation into a concealed section of the archive. Years afterward, a senior librarian admitted over wine and candlelight that the Vatican had long dreaded not a conflict of armies, but a conflict of truths. That night in 1936, he asserted, was not about a guard witnessing something peculiar. It was about a door the Vatican believed it had sealed, forever reopening again. To this day, the Swiss guard never mention it. The ring was never catalogued, and the Vatican has never clarified why. For 3 days following that night, the doors of the Archivum Secretum were locked, protected by 12 men with loaded rifles, while the bells of St. Peter's remained silent. In a quiet chamber deep within the Vatican museums, behind thick glass and beneath the dull glow of soft white lights, rests an artifact that no one was ever supposed to see. It is a small gold cross, delicate and peculiar, positioned at the rear of a private collection known only to a select few curators. According to the official documentation, it arrived during the turmoil of the Second World War, donated anonymously by a European collector. But the history behind it is far older and far more disturbing. The cross does not match any Roman or European design. Its arms curve outward like branches, terminating in patterns shaped like flames or feathers. On one side is a circle of Amharic script, on the reverse, an engraving of a lion with wings. But the most startling element is what rests at the centre, a gemstone carved into the shape of an eye, red as blood, smooth as glass. It is not indigenous to Europe or even the Holy Land. Specialists traced its source to the Ethiopian highlands near the ancient city of Aksum. The Vatican recognised this symbol. It corresponded with one discovered in the margins of the Book of Enoch, in a version only maintained in Ethiopia. The eye, they concluded, represented divine judgment, the seeing eye of the watchers. For centuries, the Church had deemed those stories heretical, buried and erased. Yet here it was, in gold, on a relic transported across continents and time. But the real enigma began when a scholar tried to examine it. In the year 1973, a young Jesuit historian named Father Leone was permitted brief access to the restricted chamber. He spent hours sketching the cross, interpreting what he could. What he documented has never been published in full, but portions of his journal were disclosed by a former student many years afterward. According to the notes, the inscription on the cross contained a date long before the era of Christ, and a phrase that translated to the covenant was taken south, taken, not lost. That one phrase caused distress within the archives. If accurate, it would indicate the cross was connected not just to Ethiopian tradition, but to something more sacred, something Roman Catholicism had long rejected. The implication was evident. The Ark of the Covenant, or a fragment of it, had journeyed to Ethiopia. And this cross, this strange ancient gold symbol, was its marker. Within days, Father Leone's investigation was terminated. The cross was returned behind glass. Leone himself was reassigned to a mission in Argentina and never spoke publicly again. The Vatican labelled the interpretation inconclusive and recommended silence. But silence has a weight of its own. And those who have viewed the cross in person say that on certain days the gemstone at its centre appears to glow faintly, as though something inside it remembers, as though it is still watching. In the grand halls of the Vatican, there are certain truths that are never spoken aloud. They are not recorded in textbooks, not taught in seminaries, and not whispered among the faithful. One of these truths is about a division, not the great schism of the East and West, not the Reformation of Martin Luther, but another separation, one that was never announced, never recorded, and yet quietly altered the course of Christian history. It occurred not with swords, but with silence, nor with passionate sermons. It developed in letters never delivered, in visits never disclosed, and in agreements that vanished in candle-lit chambers. This was the separation between the Roman Church and the ancient Ethiopian Church, a divide so profound and silent that most never realized it had occurred. Long before Rome consolidated its authority, Ethiopia practiced its own ancient form of Christianity, grounded in Jewish customs, abundant in Hebrew traditions, and guided by texts that the Vatican later classified apocryphal. The Ethiopian faith flourished in the mountains and deserts, concealed from Roman eyes, and for centuries the Vatican observed, troubled. In the early 1600s, the Jesuits were dispatched to Ethiopia not just as missionaries, but as enforcers. Their objective was to align the Ethiopian faith with Roman doctrine. They presented gifts, praised kings, and held secret debates with monks in candle-lit monasteries. But Ethiopia did not yield. Their priests refused to abandon the Book of Enoch. They would not reject the humanity of Mary. They would not substitute their chants with Latin hymns. When diplomacy collapsed, silence followed. A letter from a cardinal in the year 1639, discovered in a private archive in Avignon, speaks of the great grief the Holy See endured at the loss of the Highland Brethren. But the letter was never officially documented. No excommunication was declared. No public announcement was issued. Rome simply ceased mentioning Ethiopia, as though ignoring a wound could mend it. But Ethiopia remembered. In one monastery near Lake Tana, a carved wooden door displays an image of a lion turning its back on a two-headed eagle. The monks say it was created after the last Jesuit departed the highlands. The lion, they maintain, represents the house of Judah, the eagle the authority of Rome. The carving is not hostile. It is mournful, a quiet farewell. And yet, concealed in the Vatican archives, there is evidence the separation was never truly forgotten. A restricted folder labelled simply Ethiopia contains references to meetings, translations, and sealed documents. Most were never reopened again. Some say a pope once attempted to repair the rift. Others say the fear of what Ethiopia knew, what books they preserved, what truths they refused to erase, was too overwhelming. So the division was never public, but it was real, and it persists, quiet, as a shadow between two great churches that once shared a beginning, but chose different endings. In the year 1647, under the heavy sun of the Ethiopian highlands, a priest named Father Tesfair stood at the entrance of a stone chapel carved into the side of a mountain. He was clothed in simple white linen, his cross carved from olive wood. Waiting for him at the edge of the clearing were two men in black, Jesuits from Rome, sent to present him a choice. They came with assurances: education, protection, gold, and the blessing of the Pope. They brought letters sealed with red wax, signed by cardinals. They said Rome desired to embrace him, to make him a bridge between two churches. All he had to do was denounce the older teachings, close the Book of Enoch, and accept the authority of the Holy See. But Father Tesfair did not stir. The men waited. One of them, a younger Jesuit with weary eyes, opened a leather-bound codex and recited aloud from the Roman canon. He quoted verses that had been eliminated from Ethiopian liturgy centuries earlier. Then he read a list, books Rome had forbidden, but Ethiopia still read: Jubilees, the Book of Mary, the Story of the Watchers. When the recitation ended, Tesfair spoke. He said that Scripture was not a wall, but a well, that water flows from many places, not just Rome. He told them the mountain they stood upon had been a place of worship before Latin was even spoken, that the angels did not speak only in Rome's tongue, and that God had not asked him to choose. The older Jesuit grew furious. He warned Tesfa that defiance was heresy, that his refusal could be regarded as rebellion. He reminded him of other priests who had disappeared, of churches that were quietly locked. He asked if Tesfa was willing to risk not just his life, but his soul. Tesfa looked toward the valley. Smoke rose from nearby villages, where Jesuit missions had already substituted sacred texts. His people were frightened, not of war, but of silence, of losing the words that had shaped their prayers for 1,000 years. So he responded, "I was baptized with water from a stone basin that sits above an angel's tomb," he said. "I have kissed manuscripts that glow in the candlelight and held a cross that bled in the snow. I do not fear the Vatican. I fear forgetting who we are." That night, the Jesuits departed without a word. A few weeks later, the chapel was discovered empty. No signs of conflict, no footprints in the dust. Just a single page left on the altar, its ink still wet. It read, "The truth does not bend, it waits." To this day, Father Tesfa's name is absent from every Vatican record, but in a monastery far from Rome, his story is still shared, not as a tale of rebellion, but as a reminder. Some priests do not disappear. Some simply walk deeper into the mystery and leave the door open behind them. By the quiet northern wall of the Vatican, tucked just behind the colonnades of St. Peter's Square, stands a building most visitors pass without a glance. Its stone walls are warm from the Roman sun, its windows always shuttered, and its doors never open to tourists. This is the Pontifical Ethiopian College, the spiritual home for a handful of Ethiopian priests who have studied within the Vatican's walls for centuries. But beneath its chapel, hidden beneath layers of stone and silence, there is a chamber that does not appear on any official map. The chamber was not always a secret. In the late 1800s, when the college was newly expanded, workers discovered a narrow staircase sealed with a wooden door. The priest supervising the construction, a man named Abba Johannes, instructed them not to open it until he had consulted the Vatican Library. But by morning, the workers were gone. Not dismissed, gone. No records, no forwarding addresses, not even a wage slip left behind. Years later, a young student named Daniel was assigned to sweep the lower crypts. It was a punishment for speaking openly about books that were not approved for his studies, including the Kebra Nagast and the Book of Enoch. As he dusted along the rough stones, he noticed a hollow sound beneath one of the flagstones. When he raised it, he found a rusted key attached to a leather cord. The tag read, "Only one Abba." He brought the key to his instructor, who stared at it for a long time before leading him silently to a door concealed behind a tapestry of St. Frumentius. The lock clicked once. The door groaned open, and what lay beyond was not a storage room. It was a library, small, circular, and carved into the earth itself. The chamber was lined with wooden shelves built into the stone. On them rested scrolls, some too fragile to touch, others rolled tight in animal hide. There were books bound in palm leaves and written in languages that had long since vanished. In the centre, beneath a single shaft of light, from a hole in the ceiling, sat a wooden desk. On it, open and exposed to the air, lay a manuscript no one could date. The ink was dark red. The letters neither Ge'ez nor Latin. Some believed it was written before the fall of Axum. Others said it was a translation of a scroll taken from Jerusalem before the Roman siege. Daniel was never seen again. When the door was opened years later, the manuscript was gone. But etched into the stone above the desk, someone had carved 7 words. They buried the light so it would burn. The Vatican has never acknowledged the chamber's existence. But those who live inside the college sometimes speak of dreams, of voices that echo from beneath the floor, whispering in a tongue no one remembers. Yet everyone understands. In a quiet reading room deep within the Vatican library, where the air always smells faintly of parchment and old incense, there lies a book unlike any other. It is stored in a locked drawer inside a plain wooden desk, far from the golden halls and polished marble that most visitors imagine. Its cover is worn, its pages crumbling at the corners. Yet what lies within has kept scholars awake at night for generations. The text is not in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, or even the ancient tongue of Ge'ez. The symbols drift across the page like music, not letters. Some look like stars, others resemble flames, and between them, faint lines suggest movement, as if the script breathes. The book has no title, no known author, and no record of how it came to rest within Vatican walls. A solitary handwritten note, tucked within its pages, suggests it was composed in the tongue of celestial beings. That single claim has sparked countless controversies. During the 17th century, an eager Jesuit priest called Father Niccolo Rinaldi discovered the volume while organising uncatalogued texts. Nothing within looked familiar to him, yet the ink itself seemed unsettling. Holding each page towards the flame, he noticed the characters glimmered momentarily, visible only at the edges of his sight. He presented the manuscript to his superior, who rejected it as nothing more than a regional fake. Rinaldi couldn't abandon his fascination. Week after week he laboured under lamplight, attempting to replicate the strange symbols onto new parchment. He held the conviction, however misguided, that angelic speech must conform to mathematical principles. He analysed sequences, tallied forms, even recited prayers over the text. Then one evening, everything shifted. At daybreak, Rinaldi was discovered unconscious on the marble floor of the study chamber. Life still coursed through him, yet he had lost the ability to speak. Black ink stained his fingertips, and he gripped a torn piece of paper against his body. Only 3 words appeared on it, penned in precise, frightened handwriting. They responded to me. He never put pen to paper again. The Vatican secured the manuscript immediately. Rumours suggest it was confined beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Alternative accounts claim it was transported to the Apostolic Archive, buried far underground, where even high-ranking clergy require authorization to access. Just a handful of codebreakers have examined it since, and not one has managed to decode even a single phrase. Yet one puzzle persists. Vatican documentation reveals the manuscript's ink derives from no identifiable source, neither creature, vegetation, nor stone. It holds no iron, no pigment, no carbon residue. Beneath ultraviolet illumination, it radiates gently like lunar light reflecting off water. Some suggest the text wasn't inscribed but voiced into existence, that it originated not from a prophet, but from an utterance heard in darkness, a dialect not designed for reading but for experiencing, and those who experience it carry it forever. During a spring evening in 1954, an eerie quietness descended upon Vatican City. This wasn't the quietness of tranquility or devotion, but the kind that arrives when something feels off. The constant broadcast of Vatican radio, a channel famous for its elegant Latin hymns and distant chimes, abruptly ceased mid-sentence. The clergyman who had been broadcasting, Father Leone Ricci, never completed his thought. For almost 10 seconds, only interference filled the air. Then emerged a sound nobody could identify. Those listening at that precise instant described it starting as a deep hum, ascending into a piercing whistle. It rippled across the wavelength like wind rushing through a tight passage. Yet beneath it arose something more unusual, a voice, or something resembling one. Not in Italian, not in Latin, certainly not any recognised dialect. The quality was gentle, almost murmured, but complex, as if several voices spoke simultaneously, as though someone or something was attempting to break through. Father Ricci didn't return to broadcast that evening. Actually, he disappeared completely. The formal explanation was straightforward technical malfunction. Vatican technicians released a public notice the following day claiming a blown fuse in the station's broadcasting tower had created interference with surrounding frequencies. Yet multiple radio enthusiasts beyond Rome insisted they captured the occurrence. One of them, a former technician named Giorgio Vanni, delivered his reel-to-reel recording to a university instructor in Milan. The instructor, an authority on early Semitic dialects, listened intently. Following a lengthy silence, he rose and exited without uttering a sound. He declined to elaborate further, though he did release a concise article later that year discussing non-linear vocal structures discovered in ancient ceremonies of Eastern Africa. Privately, Giorgio claimed the voice had echoed a phrase continuously. He suspected it was Ge'ez, the ancient sacred language still employed by the Ethiopian Church. Though he couldn't comprehend it, one term emerged repeatedly: Menelik. The Vatican never acknowledged the speculation, yet within a week of the transmission, 2 Jesuit representatives were dispatched to Ethiopia under diplomatic pretense. Their assignment was never officially documented, and Father Ricci, the clergyman who had vanished during the transmission, was never encountered again. Some claim he entered the Apostolic Library days prior to the incident, transporting a container of documents freshly delivered from East Africa. Others maintain he had been examining prohibited texts connected to the Kebra Nagast and might have uncovered a link the Church preferred to keep concealed. The Vatican Broadcasting Tower has never experienced a disruption of that nature since. Yet occasionally, on the anniversary of that evening, hobbyist radio operators tune to the identical frequency and listen carefully. Sometimes, when conditions are favourable, they insist, the hum reappears. Not powerful, not distinct, but present, sufficient to spark wonder about who or what was attempting to communicate in that silence. Below Rome. Far beneath the active streets and illuminated chambers of Vatican City stretches an enormous network of burial tunnels, shadowy, cramped passages excavated centuries earlier. Long before the grand churches and marble seats of pontiffs, these served as sanctuaries for early followers of Christ, tombs and altars concealed from imperial scrutiny. Yet one of these passages conceals a riddle far more peculiar than human remains. During the spring of 1926, a crew of Vatican labourers was assigned to strengthen a deeper segment of the burial tunnels near the ancient Appian Way. One worker, a reserved man named Pietro De Luca, struck his pickaxe against what appeared to be a yielding section of soil. Instead, the barrier collapsed into a tight, enclosed space. The atmosphere that released was heavy with centuries and the aroma of moist parchment. Within the space sat a stone ledge, and upon it a compact scroll secured with weathered crimson thread. Unlike the fragile Latin manuscripts nearby, this scroll was enclosed in fabric layers that had mysteriously resisted decomposition. A metal crucifix, unusually formed and unlike any employed in Western Christianity, had been impressed into the wrapping like a stamp. Pietro, alarmed, informed his overseer, who subsequently contacted the archivist's office. Within hours, a dark vehicle arrived from the Vatican, and the scroll was removed. Pietro never encountered it again. He was reassigned to garden maintenance on the Vatican property and discreetly retired 2 years afterward, yet the account didn't conclude with him. Decades afterward, in 1973, a scholar named Sister Antonella, who focused on primitive church documents, located a single uncatalogued reference in a leather-bound inventory ledger inside the Apostolic Archive. It documented a scroll of uncertain origin, characterized as Eastern, impossible to translate, and maintained by mysterious methods. No dialect was specified, yet beside the reference appeared 2 terms, emphasized in faded garima and fireproof. Sister Antonella became fixated on this scroll. She suspected it might connect to the Abhagama Gospels, ancient Ethiopian manuscripts allegedly composed in one day by a holy man, led by celestial beings. What disturbed her was the reference to fireproofing. Throughout history, only two categories of objects were thought to withstand flames unharmed: sacred artifacts and hexes. The Vatican never confirmed possessing such a scroll, and soon after Sister Antonella requested to examine it, her access privileges were withdrawn. No justification was provided. Some murmur the scroll holds a forgotten gospel, one revealing a second covenant concealed from Rome. Others claim it describes a period when Christ travelled to territories unrecorded by the West. And some suspect it was never intended to be discovered at all. Still today, deep beneath the marble corridors, the burial tunnels remain undisturbed, and somewhere in the shadows, past the sealed chamber, a mystery might still be resting. Composed not in Latin or Greek, but in a dialect more ancient than both, a communication intended for someone who hasn't yet arrived. In the peaceful calm of the Vatican gardens, concealed behind tangles of ivy and weathered stone, stands a small, abandoned chapel that no longer receives visitors. Hardly anyone acknowledges its existence. It carries no official designation, no listing on public charts, and its entrance has remained closed to worshippers for more than a century. Yet behind its deteriorating walls exists one of the most bizarre discoveries ever made within Vatican grounds. A surface painted completely in markings nobody can decipher. The chapel was initially recorded in the late 1800s by a junior archivist named Father Emilio Carrozza. He was inventorying obscure religious buildings around St. Peter's Square when he encountered a pale sketch in the edge of an older designer's journal. The chapel was identified merely as Cappella dei Segni, the Chapel of Symbols. When Father Emilio located the site, he anticipated dust, webs, and stillness. He wasn't ready for what he witnessed inside. From ground to ceiling, the interior surface behind the sanctuary was covered in markings that challenged all established scripts. Coils, celestial bodies with irregular points, strokes that twisted and divided into branches resembling roots or streams. There were no crucifixes, no aureoles, no human representations, only forms. Several glowed dimly in flame light, as if created from a substance no longer available. Others remained barely detectable until observed from an acute perspective, exposing strata beneath the coating. He promptly reported his finding. Within 7 days, 2 academics from the Pontifical Academy came. They remained for 3 days and departed without explanation. Father Emilio requested information but received nothing. Then the chapel was shut, secured with a padlock, its access key archived in the restricted collection. Father Emilio was relocated to an assignment in Milan. Yet fascination has an odd way of resonating through decades. In 1977, a Jesuit mathematician named Brother Raphael Ibarra discovered an aged photograph of the surface in a rejected archive container. He processed the symbols through decryption technology he had developed for interpreting Enochian writings. The technology failed not once, but repeatedly when it encountered a particular section of the surface. This wasn't arbitrary information, it obeyed sequences, but sequences not of characters or digits. What troubled him further was a hand-sketched transparency he discovered folded behind the photograph. Someone had outlined sections of the surface and compared them to rock carvings discovered in the highlands of Ethiopia near Lalibela. The correspondence wasn't perfect, but it was similar enough to prompt questions. Could it be the symbols weren't designed to be interpreted at all? That they were meant to be sensed? To be invoked? In 2003, a language expert visiting the Vatican under restricted authorization maintained the surface pulsated faintly when she stood before it silently. Her conclusions were never made public, and the Vatican declined to respond. Some suspect the surface holds a lost dialect of celestial beings. Others suspect it is a chart, a caution, or an invocation for something yet to manifest. Yet nobody, not even the Vatican itself, can declare with certainty what the symbols represent, and perhaps that is precisely how they prefer it to remain. It started with murmurs, not from clergy or councils, but from visions. During the winter of 1954, Pope Pius X started awakening with peculiar phrases impressed upon his consciousness. They weren't Latin, not Italian, not any dialect he knew. He initially dismissed them as meaningless, mere scraps from the haze of slumber. Yet night after night, the expressions returned, sharper, more complete, consistently delivered in the identical voice. Not a murmur, but an incantation, profound and remote like monastics in a stone passage. Initially, he confided in nobody, yet silence in the Vatican frequently speaks loudly in its absence. His private aide detected alterations. The pontiff would linger more frequently alone in the apostolic residence, gazing through the window as if anticipating something to emerge from the distance. He would utter expressions beneath his breath, expressions that belonged to no familiar tongue in Rome. Then arrived the correspondence. A monastic from the Ethiopian highlands had dispatched it months before, yet it had remained misfiled, unopened, until a Vatican clerk delivered it accidentally. The parchment was aged, the ink almost invisible, yet the script was unmistakable. Ge'ez, the ancient ceremonial language of Ethiopia. As the pontiff opened the correspondence, something awakened within him, a familiarity, a recollection not belonging to him. He could interpret it phrase by phrase, term by term, as if he had spoken it his entire existence. Yet how? No pontiff previously had ever learned Ge'ez. No instruction in the Vatican institutions taught it. Still he grasped it. That evening, the visions transformed. Rather than only expressions, he started to perceive locations. Desert sanctuaries hewn from crimson stone, manuscripts illuminating in faint flame light. A voice would communicate, not in directive, but in alert. Safeguard the volume, maintain the lineage, don't allow Rome to disregard. The visions disturbed him so profoundly that he convened a delegation from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church under complete discretion. No documentation was maintained. No announcement followed. The meeting occurred beneath St. Peter's Basilica, distant from inquisitive attention. One of the Ethiopian clerics, an elderly man with milky eyes and a voice like stone, recited an incantation in Ge'ez. As he concluded, the pontiff echoed it back flawlessly. Nobody spoke for an extended period. The cleric finally acknowledged and presented the pontiff a small bundled package. Within was a piece of parchment claimed to be reproduced from the Book of Enoch. Maintained exclusively in Ethiopia, it held a prediction that had never surfaced in any European scripture. Based on the prediction, eventually a Roman leader would vision in the language of the East, and when he did, the forgotten lineage of David would be approaching emergence. The pontiff never discussed publicly about the meeting. The visions ceased shortly following. Yet in the collections, secured beneath strata of authorizations, exists a solitary handwritten notation in the pontiff's personal script. It belongs not to us, but to them. Still I comprehend every expression. The chimes of Vatican City resonated gently that morning, not in jubilation but in grief. Still nobody assembled. No multitude gathered against the ancient iron barriers. No clergy formed the procession. No singers raised their melody. It was a funeral absent attendance, an interment whispered into obscurity. The individual being committed to earth was neither a pontiff nor a prelate. His identity was Abalema, an Ethiopian academic who had once traversed the quiet corridors of the Vatican Library like an apparition, unshod, gentle-voiced, and frequently confused for custodial staff. Still within the stone chambers of the collections, those familiar with him named him the living manuscript, because his recall contained passages no volume had ever preserved, and beyond that, he possessed understanding the Church didn't know how to classify. He had reached Rome during the spring of 1929, not through summons but through a correspondence of urgency composed in Ge'ez, fastened with wax from a monastery that no longer existed on any chart. The correspondence was directed not to the pontiff, but to the collections themselves. It stated merely, "The bearer of the lineage is coming." Throughout years, Lemma had laboured quietly, assisting to interpret forgotten documents, several of which the Vatican insisted didn't exist. He never requested compensation. He never demanded accommodation. Still monthly, he submitted pages into the collection's secured chamber, interpretations from writings the Vatican had never recognised, including predictions from the Book of Enoch and a missing segment of the Kebra Nagast. Then, during the winter of 1942, throughout the bleakest period of the conflict, he disappeared. Nobody observed. For weeks, the globe was occupied by explosions and boundaries. It was custodial staff who eventually discovered him in the burial tunnels beneath the Ethiopian college. He was positioned on a stone platform, enclosed in a mantle, his palm resting on a secured document that carried the scent of frankincense and carbon. The formal documentation stated he expired from natural circumstances. No criminal activity, no controversy. Yet what confused investigators wasn't how he expired, but the reason. He had abandoned a solitary phrase carved into the stone adjacent to him, inscribed in a dialect that Vatican linguists couldn't interpret. Only years afterward would a junior academic realise the engraving wasn't a phrase. It was a calendar date, a forthcoming one. The funeral occurred discreetly. Only 2 sentries accompanied the casket to a private tomb designated not with an identity, but a marking, a celestial body enclosed in a blaze. No cleric officiated, no incense smouldered, yet immediately before the casket was descended, an envelope was positioned on top. It contained one parchment, a passage in Ge'ez, and beneath it the Latin interpretation. Those who protect in quietness are not abandoned. Their funeral is merely the world's postponement. Paradise already celebrated. In the remotest area of the Vatican Library, beyond the golden barriers and velvet cordons, past marble passages worn smooth by the steps of pontiffs and worshippers, exists a chamber hardly anyone has witnessed. Its entrance carries no identification. The access rests in a compartment that most clergy presume is vacant. Within, the atmosphere feels more ancient than particles. It carries the scent of wax and abandoned duration. On a stone platform, beneath strata of transparency and darkness, rests a volume unlike any other. Its binding is fractured, yet still intact. The sheets, bound manually with strands of something resembling tissue, glimmer dimly when the flame light strikes them precisely. It isn't gold coating. It's something more ancient. Several claim the ink was combined with pulverized precious stones and liquid from a source that no longer exists. Others suspect the expressions were inscribed by someone who never grew old. The script is in Ge'ez, a dialect more ancient than Latin, more ancient than Greek, and absolutely more ancient than any scripture the Church has ever produced. This is the Ethiopian scripture, and it remains. It has remained through conflicts, through starvations, through pontiffs who ascended and descended like dominions. It has remained through blazes that consumed other volumes, and through murmurs of mysteries intended to stay concealed. Nobody genuinely knows when it reached the Vatican. Several claim it was transported by a dying Jesuit. Others insist it was concealed during the Second World Conflict, stitched into the interior of a prelate's garment. Whatever the reality might be, the Vatican has never exhibited it, never recognised it, never recorded it in the formal documentation. Still, it exists there. The account goes that the final individual to recite it aloud forfeited his voice for 7 days. Another individual, an academic from Germany, escaped Rome the day following reading one section. He was never witnessed again. A third, a junior cleric from the Ethiopian college, attempted to reproduce one sheet manually. When he completed, the ink vanished before his perception. What is it about this scripture that unsettles the supreme authorities in the Church? Why does it remain secured away, unread and unspoken? Several suspect the response exists in its composition. The Ethiopian scripture holds more volumes than the Roman canon, volumes of Enoch, of Jubilees, of wisdom, long rejected as mythology. In its sheets, celestial beings don't murmur, they mourn. Prophets don't merely forecast, they recall. And Christ, in one vision, doesn't return in the atmosphere but emerges from the centre of Africa, speaking expressions the Vatican cannot interpret. No directive has commanded its elimination. No pontiff has attempted to incinerate it, and so it remains. For whom? Nobody knows. Yet in the calm of that chamber, several claim you can detect the slightest resonance, like chanting from a location too profound for stone to suppress. And somewhere, possibly in the visions of a forgotten monastic, the scripture remains for someone courageous enough to recite it aloud. Appreciate your attention. Right to the conclusion. If one of these concealed chapters awakened something within you, prompted you to wonder what exists behind secured entrances or forgotten truths, share with us in the comments. We examine everyone. And if you haven't already, ensure to press subscribe and activate the notification so you never overlook the next riddle we reveal. Remain inquisitive, remain contemplative, and until next occasion, rest peacefully and vision profoundly.